Chapter 19 of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 19. High up in the old carved roof, meanwhile, the spiders of centuries still hung their flaunting webs with a profusion that old Dr. Grimshaw would have been ravished to see. But even this was to be remedied, for one day, on looking in, Redcliffe found the great hall dim with floating dust, and down through it came great floating masses of cobweb, out of which the old doctor would have undertaken to regenerate the world. And he saw, dimly aloft, men on ladders sweeping away these accumulations of years, and breaking up the haunts and residences of hereditary spiders. The stately old hall had been in process of cleaning and adapting to the banquet purposes of the 19th century, which it was accustomed to subserve, in so proud a way, in the 16th. It was, in the first place, well swept and cleansed. The painted glass windows were cleansed from dust, and several panes, which had been unfortunately broken and filled with common glass, were filled in with colored panes, which the warden had picked up somewhere in his antiquarian researches. They were not, to be sure, just what was wanted. A piece of a saint, from some cathedral window, supplying what was lacking of the gorgeous purple of a medieval king, but the general effect was rich and good, whenever the misty English atmosphere supplied sunshine bright enough to pervade it. Tapestry, too, from antique looms, faded but still gorgeous, was hung upon the walls. Some suits of armor that hung beneath the festal gallery were polished till the old battered helmets and pierced breastplates sent a gleam like that with which they had flashed across the battlefields of old. So now the great day of the warden's dinner had arrived, and, as may be supposed, there were fiery times in the venerable old kitchen. The cook, according to ancient custom, concocted many antique dishes, such as used to be set before kings and nobles, dainties that might have called the dead out of their graves, combinations of ingredients that had ceased to be put together for centuries, historic dishes, which had long ceased to be in the list of revels. Then there was the stalwart English cheer of the sirloin and the round. There were the vast plum puddings, the juicy mutton, the venison. There was the game, just now in season, the half-tame wild-fowl of English covers, the half-domesticated wild deer of English parks, the heathcock from the far-off hills of Scotland, and one little prairie hen, and some canvas-back ducks, obtained, heaven knows how, in compliment to Redcliffe, from his native shores. Oh, the jolly old kitchen! How rich the flavored smoke that went up its vast chimney! How inestimable the atmosphere of steam that was diffused through it! How did the old men peep into it, even venture across the threshold, braving the hot wrath of the cook and his assistants, for the sake of imbuing themselves with these rich and delicate flavors, receiving them as it were spiritually, for, received through the breath and in the atmosphere, it was really a spiritual enjoyment. The ghosts of ancient epicures seemed, on that day and the few preceding ones, to haunt the dim passages, snuffing in with shadowy nostrils the rich vapors, assuming visibility in the congenial medium, almost becoming earthly again in the strength of their earthly longings for one other feast such as they used to enjoy. Nor is it to be supposed that it was only these antique dainties that the warden provided for his feast. No, if the cook, the cultured and recondite old cook, who had accumulated within himself all that his predecessors knew for centuries, if he lacked anything of modern fashion and improvement, he had supplied his defect by temporary assistance from a London club, and the bill of fare was provided with dishes that Soyer would not have harshly criticized. The ethereal delicacy of modern taste, the nice adjustment of flowers, the French style of cookery, was richly attended to, and the list was long of dishes with fantastic names, fish, fowl, and flesh, and entremets, and sweets, as the English call them, and sugared cakes too numerous to think of. The wines we will not take upon ourselves to enumerate, but the juice, then destined to be quaffed, was in part the precious vintages that had been broached half a century ago, and had been ripening ever since. The rich and dry old port, so unlovely to the natural palate that it requires long English seasoning to get it down. The sherry, imported before these modern days of adulteration. Some claret, the warden said of rarest vintage, some burgundy, of which it was the quality to warm the blood and genialize existence for 3 days after it was drunk. Then there was a rich liquid contributed to this department by Redcliffe himself, for some weeks since, when the banquet first loomed in the distance, he had, anxious to evince his sense of the warden's kindness, sent across the ocean for some famous Madeira which he had inherited from the doctor, and never tasted yet. This, together with some of the western wines of America, had arrived, and was ready to be broached. The warden tested these modern wines, and recognized a new flavor, but gave it only a moderate approbation, for in truth an elderly gentleman has not a wide appreciation of wines, nor loves new things in this kind more than in literature or life. But he tasted the Madeira too, and underwent an ecstasy, which was only alleviated by the dread of gout, which he had an idea that this wine must bring on. And truly, if it were so splendid a wine as he pronounced it, some pain ought to follow as the shadow of such a pleasure. As it was a festival of antique date, the dinner hour had been fixed earlier than is usual at such stately banquets, namely at 6 o'clock, which was long before the dusky hour at which Englishmen love best to dine. About that period, the carriages drove into the old courtyard of the hospital in great abundance, blocking up, too, the ancient portal, and remaining in a line outside. Carriages they were with armorial bearings, family coaches in which came Englishmen in their black coats and white neckcloths, elderly, white-headed, fresh-colored, squat, not beautiful certainly, nor particularly dignified, nor very well dressed, nor with much of an imposing air, but yet, somehow or other, producing an effect of force, respectability, reliableness, trust, which is probably deserved, since it is invariably experienced. Cold they were in deportment, and looked coldly on the stranger, who, on his part, drew himself up with an extra haughtiness and reserve, and felt himself in the midst of his enemies, and more as if he were going to do battle than to sit down to a friendly banquet. The warden introduced him, as an American diplomatist, to one or two of the gentlemen, who regarded him forbiddingly, as Englishmen do before dinner. Not long after Redcliffe had entered the reception-room, which was but shortly before the hour appointed for the dinner, there was another arrival, betokened by the clatter of hoofs and grinding wheels in the courtyard, and then entered a gentleman of different mien from the bluff, ruddy, simple-minded, yet worldly Englishmen around him. He was a tall, dark man, with a black mustache and almost olive skin, a slender, lithe figure, a flexible face, quick, flashing, mobile. His deportment was graceful. His dress, though it seemed to differ in little or nothing from that of the gentleman in the room, had yet a grace and picturesqueness in his mode of wearing it. He advanced to the warden, who received him with distinction, and yet, Redcliffe fancied, not exactly with cordiality. It seemed to Redcliffe that the warden looked round, as if with the purpose of presenting Redcliffe to this gentleman, but he himself, from some latent reluctance, had turned away and entered into conversation with one of the other gentlemen, who said now, looking at the newcomer, "Are you acquainted with this last arrival?" "Not at all," said Redcliffe. "I know Lord Braithwaite by sight, indeed, but have had no introduction. He is a man, certainly, of distinguished appearance." "Why, pretty well," said the gentleman, "but un-English, as also are his manners. It is a pity to see an old English family represented by such a person. Neither he, his father, nor grandfather was born among us. He has far more Italian blood than enough to drown the slender stream of Anglo-Saxon and Norman. His modes of life, His prejudices, his estates, his religion are unlike our own, and yet here he is in the position of an old English gentleman, possibly to be a peer. You, whose nationality embraces that of all the world, cannot, I suppose, understand this English feeling." "Pardon me," said Redcliffe. "I can perfectly understand it. An American, in his feelings towards England, has all the jealousy and exclusiveness of Englishmen themselves, perhaps, indeed, a little exaggerated." "I beg your pardon," said the Englishman incredulously. "I think you cannot possibly understand it." The guests were by this time all assembled, and at the warden's bidding they moved from the reception-room to the dining-hall, in some order and precedence of which Redcliffe could not exactly discover the principle, though he found that to himself, in his quality, doubtless, of ambassador, there was assigned a pretty high place. A venerable dignitary of the church, a dean he seemed to be, having asked a blessing, the fair scene of the banquet now lay before the guests, presenting a splendid spectacle in the high-walled, antique, tapestried hall, overhung with the dark, intricate oaken beams, with the high Gothic windows, through one of which the setting sunbeams streamed, and showed the figures of kings and warriors, and the old Braithwaites among them. Beneath and adown the hall extended the long line of the tables, covered with the snow of the damask tablecloth, on which glittered, gleamed, and shone a good quality of ancient ancestral plate, and an épergne of silver, extending down the middle, also the gleam of golden wine in the decanters, and truly Redcliffe thought that it was a noble spectacle, made so by old and stately associations, which made a noble banquet of what otherwise would be only a vulgar dinner. The English have this advantage, and know how to make use of it. They bring, in these old, time-honored feasts, all the past to sit down and take the stately refreshment along with them, and they pledge the historic characters in their wine. A printed bill of fare in gold letters lay by each plate, on which Redcliffe saw the company glancing with great interest. The first dish, of course, was turtle soup, of which, as the gentleman next him, the mayor of a neighbouring town, told Redcliffe, it was allowable to take twice. This was accompanied, according to one of those rules which one knows not whether they are arbitrary or founded on some deep reason, by a glass of punch. Then came the noble turbot, the salmon, the sole, and divers of fishes, and the dinner fairly set in. The genial warden seemed to have given liberal orders to the attendants, for they spared not to offer hock, champagne, sherry to the guests, and good bitter ale, foaming in the goblet, and so the stately banquet went on, with somewhat tedious magnificence, and yet with a fullness of effect and thoroughness of sombre life that made Redcliffe feel that, so much importance being assigned to it, it being so much believed in, it was indeed a feast. The cumbrous courses swept by, one after another, and Redcliffe, finding it heavy work, sat idle most of the time, regarding the hall, the old decaying beams, the armor hanging beneath the galleries, and these Englishmen feasting where their fathers had feasted for so many ages, the same occasion, the same men, probably, in appearance, though the black coat and the white neckcloth had taken the place of rough, embroidered doublet and the magnificence of other ages. After all, the English have not such good things to eat as we in America, and certainly do not know better how to make them palatable. Well, but by and by the dinner came to a conclusion, as regarded the eating part. The cloth was withdrawn. A dessert of fruits fresh and dried, pines, hothouse grapes, and all candied conserves of the Indies, was put on the long extent of polished mahogany. There was a tuning up of musicians, an interrogative drawing of fiddle bows, and other musical twangs and puffs, the decanters opposite the warden and his vice-president, sherry, port, Redcliffe's Madeira, and claret, were put in motion along the table, and the guests filled their glasses for the toast which, at English dinner tables, is of course the first to be honored, the Queen. Then the band struck up the good old anthem, God Save the Queen, which the whole company rose to their feet to sing. It was a spectacle both interesting and a little ludicrous to Redcliffe, being so apart from an American's sympathies, so unlike anything that he has in his life or possibilities. This active and warm sentiment of loyalty, in which love of country centers and assimilates, and transforms itself into a passionate affection for a person, in whom they love all their institutions. To say the truth, it seemed a happy notion, nor could the American, while he comforted himself in the pride of his democracy, and that he himself was a sovereign, could he help envying it a little, this childlike love and reverence for a person embodying all their country, their past, their earthly future. He felt that it might be delightful to have a sovereign, provided that sovereign were always a woman, and perhaps a young and fine one. But indeed this is not the difficulty, methinks, in English institutions, which the American finds it hardest to deal with. He could endure a born sovereign, especially if it made such a mere pageant as the English make of theirs. What we find it hardest to conceive of is the satisfaction with which English think of a race above them, with privileges that they cannot share, entitled to condescend to them, and to have gracious and beautiful manners at their expense, to be kind, simple, unpretending, because these qualities are more available than haughtiness, to be specimens of perfect manhood, all these advantages in consequence of their position. If the peerage were a mere name, it would be nothing to envy, but it is so much more than a name. It enables men to be really so superior. The poor, the lower classes, might bear this well enough, but the classes that come next to the nobility, the upper middle classes, how they bear it so lovingly is what must puzzle the American. But probably the advantage of the peerage is the less perceptible, the nearer it is looked at. It must be confessed that Redcliffe, as he looked at this assembly of peers and gentlemen, thought with some self-gratulation of the probability that he had within his power as old a rank, as desirable a station as the best of them, and that if he were restrained from taking it, it would probably only be by the democratic pride that made him feel that he could not, retaining all his manly sensibility, accept this gewgaw on which the ages, his own country especially, had passed judgment, while it had been suspended over his head. He felt himself, at any rate, in a higher position, having the option of taking this rank, and forbearing to do so, than if he took it. After this ensued a ceremony which is of antique date in old English corporations and institutions, at their high festivals. It is called the loving cup. A sort of herald or toastmaster behind the warden's chair made proclamation, reciting the names of the principal guests, and announcing to them, "The warden of the Braithwaite Hospital drinks to you in a loving cup," of which cup, having sipped, or seemed to sip, for Redcliffe observed that the old drinkers were rather shy of it, a small quantity, he sent it down the table. Its progress was accompanied with a peculiar entanglement of ceremony, one guest standing up while another drinks, being pretty much as follows. First, each guest received it covered from the next above him, the same took from the silver cup its silver cover, the guest drank with a bow to the warden and company, took the cover from the preceding guest, covered the cup, handed it to the next below him, then again removed the cover, replaced it after the guest had drunk, who, on his part, went through the same ceremony. And thus the cup went slowly on its way down the stately hall, these ceremonies being, it is said, originally precautions against the risk, in wild times, of being stabbed by the man who was drinking with you, or poisoned by one who should fail to be your taster. The cup was a fine ancient piece of plate, massive, heavy, curiously wrought with armorial bearings, in which the leopard's head appeared. Its contents, so far as Redcliffe could analyze them by a moderate sip, appeared to be claret sweetened with spices, and, however suited to the peculiarity of antique palates, was not greatly to Redcliffe's taste. Redcliffe's companion just below him while the loving-cup was beginning its march, had been explaining the origin of the custom as a defence of the drinker in times of deadly feud. When it had reached Lord Braithwaite, who drank and passed it to Redcliffe covered, and with the usual bow, Redcliffe looked into his lordship's Italian eyes and dark face as he did so, and the thought struck him that, if there could possibly be any use in keeping up this old custom, it might be so now, for, how intimated he could hardly tell, he was sensible in his deepest self of a deadly hostility in this dark, courteous, handsome face. He kept his eyes fixed on his lordship as he received the cup, and felt that in his own glance there was an acknowledgment of the enmity that he perceived, and a defiance, expressed without visible sign, and felt in the bow with which they greeted one another. When they had both resumed their seats, Redcliffe chose to make this ceremonial intercourse the occasion of again addressing him. "I know not whether your lordship is more accustomed than myself to these stately ceremonials," said he. "No," said Lord Braithwaite, whose English was very good. "But this is an old ceremony, and an ingenious one, for it does not twine us into knotted links of love, this loving cup, like a wreath of bacchanals whom I have seen surrounding an antique vase. Doubtless it has great efficacy in entwining a company of friendly guests into one affectionate society." "Yes, it should seem so," replied Redcliffe with a smile, and again meeting those black eyes, which smiled back on him. "It should seem so, but it appears that the origin of the custom was quite different, and that it was as a safeguard to a man when he drank with his enemy. What a peculiar flavor it must have given to the liquor, when the eyes of two deadly foes met over the brim of the loving cup, and the drinker knew that if he withdrew it, a dagger would be in his heart, and the other watched him drink, to see if it was poison." "Ah," responded his lordship, "they had strange fashions in those rough old times. Nowadays we neither stab, shoot, nor poison. I scarcely think we hate, except as interest guides us, without malevolence." This singular conversation was interrupted by a toast, and the rising of one of the guests to answer it. Several other toasts of routine succeeded, one of which being to the honor of the old founder of the hospital, Lord Braithwaite, as his representative, rose to reply, which he did in good phrases, in a sort of eloquence unlike that of the Englishmen around him, and, sooth to say, comparatively unaccustomed as he must have been to the use of the language, much more handsomely than they. In truth, Redcliffe was struck and amused with the rudeness, the slovenliness, the inartistic quality of the English speakers, who rather seemed to avoid grace and neatness of set purpose, as if they would be ashamed of it. Nothing could be more ragged than these utterances which they called speeches, so patched and darned, and yet, somehow or other, though dull and heavy as all which seemed to inspire them, they had a kind of force. Each man seemed to have the faculty of getting, after some rude fashion, at the sense and feeling that was in him, and without glibness, without smoothness, without form or comeliness, still the object with which each one rose to speak was accomplished, and what was more remarkable, it seemed to be accomplished without the speakers having any particular plan for doing it. He was surprised, too, to observe how loyally every man seemed to think himself bound to speak, and rose to do his best, however unfit his usual habits made him for the task. Observing this, and thinking how many an American would be taken aback and dumbfounded by being called on for a dinner speech, he could not but doubt the correctness of the general opinion that Englishmen are naturally less facile of public speech than our countrymen. "You surpass your countrymen," said Redcliffe, when his lordship resumed his seat, amid rapping and loud applause. "My countrymen? I scarcely know whether you mean the English or Italians," said Lord Braithwaite. "Like yourself, I am a hybrid, with really no country, and ready to take up with any." "I have a country, one which I am little inclined to deny," replied Redcliffe, gravely, while a flush, perhaps of conscientious shame, rose to his brow. His lordship bowed, with a dark Italian smile, but Redcliffe's attention was drawn away from the conversation by a toast which the warden now rose to give, and in which he found himself mainly concerned, with a little preface of kind words, not particularly aptly applied, to the great and kindred country beyond the Atlantic. The worthy warden proceeded to remark that his board was honored on this high festival with a guest from that new world, a gentleman yet young, but already distinguished in the councils of his country, the bearer, he remarked, of an honored English name, which might well claim to be remembered here, and on this occasion, although he had understood from his friend that the American bearers of this name did not count kindred with the English ones. This gentleman, he further observed, with considerable flourish and emphasis, had recently been called from his retirement and wanderings into the diplomatic service of his country, which he would say, from his knowledge, the gentleman was well calculated to honor. He drank the health of the Honorable Edward Redcliffe, Ambassador of the United States to the court of Hohenlinden. Our English cousins received this toast with the kindest enthusiasm, as they always do any such allusion to our country, it being a festal feeling, not to be used except on holidays. They rose with glass in hand, in honor of the ambassador. The band struck up "Hail Columbia," and our hero marshalled his thoughts as well he might for the necessary response, and when the tumult subsided, he arose. His quick apprehending had taught him something of the difference of taste between an English and an American audience at a dinner table. He felt that there must be a certain looseness and carelessness and roughness, and yet a certain restraint, that he must not seem to aim at speaking well, although, for his own ambition, he was not content to speak ill, that, somehow or other, he must get a heartiness into his speech, that he must not polish, nor be too neat, and must come with a certain rudeness to his good points, as if he blundered on them, and were surprised into them. Above all, he must let the good wine and cheer, and all that he knew and really felt of English hospitality, as represented by the kind warden, do its work upon his heart, and speak up to the extent of what he felt, and if a little more, then no great harm, about his own love for the fatherland, and the broader grounds of the relations between the two countries. On this system Redcliffe began to speak, and being naturally and habitually eloquent, and of mobile and ready sensibilities, he succeeded, between art and nature, in making a speech that absolutely delighted the company, who made the old hall echo, and the banners wave and tremble, and the boards shake, and the glasses jingle with their rapturous applause. What he said, or some shadow of it, and more than he quite liked to own, was reported in the county paper that gave a report of the dinner, but on glancing over it, it seems not worth while to produce this eloquent effort in our pages, the occasion and topics being of merely temporary interest. Redcliffe sat down and sipped his claret, feeling a little ashamed of himself, as people are apt to do after a display of this kind. "You know the way to the English heart better than I do," remarked his lordship, after a polite compliment to the speech. "Methinks these dull English are being improved in your atmosphere. The English need a change every few centuries, either by immigration of new stock, or transportation of the old, or else they grow too gross and earthly, with their beef, mutton, and ale. I think, now, it might benefit both countries if your New England population were to be reciprocally exchanged with an equal number of Englishmen. Indeed, Italians might do as well." "I should regret," said Redcliffe, "to change the English, heavy as they are." "You are an admirable Englishman," said his lordship. "For my part, I cannot say that the people are very much to my taste, any more than their skies and climate, in which I have shivered during the 2 years I have spent here." Here their conversation ceased, and Redcliffe listened to a long train of speechifying, in the course of which everybody, almost, was toasted, everybody present, at all events, and many absent. The warden's old wine was not spared, the music rang and resounded from the gallery, and everybody seemed to consider it a model feast, although there were no very vivid signs of satisfaction, but a decorous, heavy enjoyment, a dull red heat of pleasure, without flame. Soda and seltzer water, and coffee by and by were circulated, and at a late hour the company began to retire. Before taking his departure, Lord Braithwaite resumed his conversation with Redcliffe, and, as it appeared, with the purpose of making a hospitable proposition. "I live very much alone," said he, "being insulated from my neighbours by many circumstances, habits, religion, and everything else peculiarly English. If you are curious about old English modes of life, I can show you, at least, an English residence, little altered within a century past. Pray come and spend a week with me before you leave this part of the country. Besides, I know the court to which you are accredited, and can give you perhaps useful information about it." Redcliffe looked at him in some surprise, and with a nameless hesitation, for he did not like his lordship, and had fancied, in truth, that there was a reciprocal antipathy. Nor did he yet feel that he was mistaken in this respect, although his lordship's invitation was given in a tone of frankness, and seemed to have no reserve, except that his eyes did not meet his like Anglo-Saxon eyes, and there seemed an Italian looking out from within the man. But Redcliffe had a sort of repulsion within himself, and he questioned whether it would be fair to his proposed host to accept his hospitality, while he had this secret feeling of hostility and repugnance, which might be well enough accounted for by the knowledge that he secretly entertained hostile interests to their race, and half a purpose of putting them in force. And, besides this, although Redcliffe was ashamed of the feeling, he had a secret dread, a feeling that it was not just a safe thing to trust himself in this man's power, for he had a sense, sure as death, that he did not wish him well, and had a secret dread of the American. But he laughed within himself at this feeling, and drove it down. Yet it made him feel that there could be no disloyalty in accepting his lordship's invitation, because it was given in as little friendship as it would be accepted. "I had almost made my arrangements for quitting the neighborhood," said he, after a pause, "nor can I shorten the week longer which I had promised to spend with my very kind friend the warden. Yet your lordship's kindness offers me a great temptation, and I would gladly spend the next ensuing week at Braithwaite Hall." "I shall expect you, then," said Lord Braithwaite. "You will find me quite alone, except my chaplain, a scholar, and a man of the world, whom you will not be sorry to know." He bowed and took his leave, without shaking hands, as an American would have thought it natural to do after such a hospitable agreement, nor did Redcliffe make any motion towards it, and was glad that his lordship had omitted it. On the whole, there was a secret dissatisfaction with himself, a sense that he was not doing quite a frank and true thing in accepting this invitation, and he only made peace with himself on the consideration that Lord Braithwaite was as little cordial in asking the visit as he in acceding to it. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The guests were now rapidly taking their departure, and the warden and Redcliffe were soon left alone in the antique hall, which now, in its solitude, presented an aspect far different from the gay festivity of an hour before. The duskiness up in the carved oaken beams seemed to descend and fill the hall, and the remembrance of the feast was like one of those that had taken place centuries ago, with which this was now numbered, and growing ghostly and faded and sad, even as they had long been. "Well, my dear friend," said the warden, stretching himself and yawning, "it is over. Come into my study with me, and we will have a deviled turkey bone and a pint of sherry in peace and comfort." "I fear I can make no figure at such a supper," said Redcliffe, "but I admire your inexhaustibleness in being ready for midnight refreshment after such a feast." "Not a glass of good liquor has moistened my lips tonight," said the warden, "save and except such as was supplied by a decanter of water made brown with toast, and such a sip as I took to the health of the Queen, and another to that of the ambassador to Hohenlinden. It is the only way when a man has this vast labor of speechifying to do, and indeed there is no possibility of keeping up a jolly countenance for such a length of time except on toast water." They accordingly adjourned to the warden's sanctum, where that worthy dignitary seemed to enjoy himself over his sherry and cracked bones in a degree that he probably had not heretofore, while Redcliffe, whose potations had been more liberal and who was feverish and disturbed, tried the effect of a little brandy and soda water. As often happens at such midnight symposiums, the two friends found themselves in a more kindly and confidential vein than had happened before, great as had been the kindness and confidence already grown up between them. Redcliffe told his friend of Lord Braithwaite's invitation and of his own resolution to accept it. "Why not? You will do well," said the warden, "and you will find his lordship an accustomed host, and the old house most interesting. If he knows the secrets of it himself and will show them, they will be well worth the seeing." "I have had a scruple in accepting this invitation," said Redcliffe. "I cannot see why," said the warden. "I advise it by all means, since I shall lose nothing by it myself, as it will not lop off any part of your visit to me." "My dear friend," said Redcliffe, irresistibly impelled to a confidence which he had not meditated a moment before, "there is a foolish secret which I must tell you, if you will listen to it, and which I have only not revealed to you because it seemed to me foolish and dreamlike, because, too, I am an American and a Democrat, because I am ashamed of myself and laugh at myself." "Is it a long story?" asked the warden. "I can make it of any length and almost any brevity," said Redcliffe. "I will fill my pipe then," answered the warden, "and listen at my ease, and if, as you intimate, there prove to be any folly in it, I will impute it all to the kindly freedom with which you have partaken of our English hospitality, and forget it before tomorrow morning." He settled himself in his easy chair in a most luxurious posture, and Redcliffe, who felt a strange reluctance to reveal, for the first time in his life, the shadowy hopes, if hopes they were, and purposes, if such they could be called, with which he had amused himself so many years, begun the story from the earliest period he could remember. He told even of his earliest recollection with an old woman in the almshouse, and how he had been found there by the doctor and educated by him with all the hints and half revelations that had been made to him. He described the singular character of the doctor, his scientific pursuits, his evident accomplishments, his great abilities, his morbidness and melancholy, his moodiness, and finally his death, and the singular circumstances that accompanied it. The story took a considerable time to tell, and after its close, the warden, who had only interrupted it by now and then a question to make it plainer, continued to smoke his pipe slowly and thoughtfully for a long while. "This doctor of yours was a singular character," said he. "Evidently, from what you tell me as to the accuracy of his local reminiscences, he must have been of this part of the country, of this immediate neighborhood, and such a man could not have grown up here without being known. I myself, for I am an old fellow now, might have known him if he lived to manhood hereabouts." "He seemed old to me when I first met him," said Redcliffe, "but children make no distinctions of age. He might have been 45 then, as well as I can judge." "You are now 27 or 8, said the warden, "and were 4 years old when you first knew him. He might now be 65. Do you know, my friend, that I have something like a certainty that I know who your doctor was?" "How strange this seems!" exclaimed Redcliffe. "It has never struck me that I should be able to identify this singular personage with any surroundings or any friends." The warden, to requite his friend's story, and without as yet saying a word, good or bad, on his ancestral claims, proceeded to tell him some of the gossip of the neighborhood, what had been gossip 30 or 40 years ago, but was now forgotten, or at all events seldom spoken of, and only known to the old at the present day. He himself remembered it only as a boy, and imperfectly. There had been a personage of that day, a man of poor estate, who had fallen deeply in love and been betrothed to a young lady of family. He was a young man of more than ordinary abilities and of great promise, though small fortune. It was not well known how, but the match between him and the young lady was broken off, and his place was supplied by the then proprietor of Braithwaite Hall, as it was supposed, by the artifices of her mother. There had been circumstances of peculiar treachery in the matter, and Mr. Oglethorpe had taken it severely to heart, so severely, indeed, that he had left the country after selling his ancestral property, and had only been occasionally heard of again. Now, from certain circumstances, it had struck the warden that this might be the mysterious doctor of whom Redcliffe spoke. "But why," suggested Redcliffe, "should a man with these wrongs to avenge to take such an interest in a descendant of his enemy's family?" "That is a strong point in favor of my supposition," replied the warden. "There is certainly, and has long been, a degree of probability that the true heir of this family exists in America. If Oglethorpe could discover him, he ousts his enemy from the estate and honors, and substitutes the person whom he has discovered and educated. Most certainly there is revenge in the thing. Should it happen now, however, the triumph would have lost its sweetness, even were Oglethorpe alive to partake of it, for his enemy is dead, leaving no heir, and this foreign branch has come in without Oglethorpe's aid. The friends remained musing a considerable time, each in his own train of thought, till the warden suddenly spoke. "Do you mean to prosecute this apparent claim of yours?" "I have not intended to do so," said Redcliffe. "Of course," said the warden, "that should depend upon the strength of your ground, and I understand you that there is some link wanting to establish it. Otherwise, I see not how you can hesitate. Is it a little thing to hold a claim to an old English estate and honors?" "No, it is a very great thing to an Englishman born, and who need give up no higher birthright to avail himself of it," answered Redcliffe. "You will laugh at me, my friend, but I cannot help feeling that I, a simple citizen of a republic, yet with none above me except those whom I help to place there, and who are my servants, not my superiors, must stoop to take these honors. I leave a set of institutions which are the noblest that the wit and civilization of man have yet conceived, to enlist myself in one that is based on a far lower conception of man, and which therefore lowers everyone who shares in it. Besides," said the young man, his eyes kindling with the ambition which had been so active a principle in his life, "what prospects, what rewards for spirited exertion, what a career only open to an American would I give up to become merely a rich and idle Englishman, belonging, as I should, nowhere, without a possibility of struggle such as a strong man loves, with only a mockery of a title, which in these days really means nothing, hardly more than one of our own honorables. What has any success in English life to offer, even were it within my reach, which, as a stranger, it would not be, to balance the proud career of an American statesman?" "True, you might be a president, I suppose," said the warden rather contemptuously, "a 4 years' potentate. It seems to me an office about on a par with that of the Lord Mayor of London. For my part, I would rather be a baron of 300 or 400 years' antiquity." "We talk in vain," said Redcliffe, laughing. "We do not approach one another's ideas on this subject. But waiving all speculations as to my attempting to avail myself of this claim, do you think I can fairly accept this invitation to visit Lord Braithwaite? There is certainly a possibility that I may arraign myself against his dearest interests. Conscious of this, can I accept his hospitality?" The warden paused. "You have not sought access to his house," he observed. "You have no designs, it seems, no settled designs, at all events, against his lordship, nor is there a probability that they would be forwarded by your accepting this invitation, even if you had any. I do not see but you may go. The only danger is that his lordship's engaging qualities may seduce you into dropping your claims out of a chivalrous feeling, which I see is among your possibilities. To be sure, it would be more satisfactory if he knew your actual position and should then renew his invitation. I am convinced, said Redcliffe, looking up from his musing posture, that he does know them. You are surprised, but in all Lord Braithwaite's manner towards me there has been an undefinable something that makes me aware that he knows on what terms we stand towards each other. There is nothing inconceivable in this. The family have for generations been suspicious of an American line and have more than once sent messengers to try to search out and put a stop to the apprehension. Why should it not have come to their knowledge that there was a person with such claims, and that he is now in England? It certainly is possible, replied the warden, and if you are satisfied that his lordship knows it, or even suspects it, you meet him on fair ground. But I fairly tell you, my good friend, that his lordship, being a man of unknown principles of honor, outlandish, and an Italian in habit and moral sense, I scarcely like to trust you in his house, he being aware that your existence may be inimical to him. My humble board is the safer of the two. Pshaw, said Redcliffe, you Englishmen are so suspicious of anybody not regularly belonging to yourselves. Poison and the dagger haunt your conceptions of all others. In America, you think we kill every third man with the Bowie knife. But supposing there were any grounds for your suspicion, I would still encounter it. An American is no braver than any Englishman, but still he is not quite so chary of his life as the latter, who never risks it except on the most imminent necessity. We take such matters easy. In regard to this invitation, I feel that I can honorably accept it, and there are many idle and curious motives that impel me to it. I will go. Be it so, but you must come back to me for another week after finishing your visit, said the warden. After all, it was an idle fancy in me that there could be any danger. His lordship has good English blood in his veins, and it would take oceans and rivers of Italian treachery to wash out the sterling quality of it. And, my good friend, as to these claims of yours, I would not have you trust too much to what is probably a romantic dream. Yet, were the dream to come true, I should think the British peerage honored by such an accession to its ranks. And now to bed, for we have heard the chimes of midnight, 2 hours agone. They accordingly retired, and Redcliffe was surprised to find what a distinctness his ideas respecting his claim to the Braithwaite honors had assumed, now that he, after so many years, had imparted them to another. Heretofore, though his imagination had played with them so much, they seemed the veriest dreams. Now they had suddenly taken form and hardened into substance, and he became aware in spite of all the lofty and patriotic sentiments which he had expressed to the warden, that these prospects had really much importance in his mind. Redcliffe, during the few days that he was to spend at the hospital, previous to his visit to Braithwaite Hall, was conscious of a restlessness such as we have all felt on the eve of some interesting event. He wondered at himself at being so much wrought up by so simple a thing as he was about to do, but it seemed to him like a coming home after an absence of centuries. It was like an actual prospect of entrance into a castle in the air, the shadowy threshold of which should assume substance enough to bear his foot. Its thin, fantastic walls actually protect him from the sun and rain, its hall echo with his footsteps, its hearth warm him. That delicious, thrilling uncertainty between reality and fancy, in which he had often been enwrapped since his arrival in this region, enveloped him more strongly than ever, and with it, too, there came a sort of apprehension which sometimes shuddered through him like an icy draught, or the touch of cold steel to his heart. He was ashamed, too, to be conscious of anything like fear, yet he would not acknowledge it for fear, and indeed there was such an airy, exhilarating, thrilling pleasure bound up with it that it could not really be so. It was in this state of mind that a day or two after the feast he saw Colcord sitting on the bench before the portal of the hospital in the sun, which, September though it was, still came warm and bright, for English sunshine, into that sheltered spot, a spot where many generations of old men had warmed their limbs while they looked down into the torpid life of the old village that trailed its homely yet picturesque street along by the venerable buildings of the hospital. "My good friend," said Redcliffe, "I am about leaving you for a time. Indeed, with the limited time at my disposal, it is possible that I may not be able to come back hither except for a brief visit. Before I leave you, I would fain know something more about one whom I must ever consider my benefactor." "Yes," said the old man, with his usual benignant quiet. "I saved your life. It is yet to be seen, perhaps, whether thereby I made myself your benefactor. I trust so." "I feel it so, at least," answered Redcliffe, "and I assure you life has a new value for me since I came to this place, for I have a deeper hold upon it, as it were, more hope from it, more trust in something good to come of it." "This is a good change, or should be so," quoth the old man. "Do you know," continued Redcliffe, "how long you have been a figure in my life?" "I know it," said Colcord, "though you might well have forgotten it." "Not so," said Redcliffe. "I remember, as if it were this morning, that time in New England when I first saw you." "The man with whom you then abode," said Concord, "knew who I was." "And he being dead, and finding you here now by such a strange coincidence," said Redcliffe, "and being myself a man capable of taking your counsel, I would have you impart it to me, for I assure you that the current of my life runs darkly on, and I would be glad of any light on its future or even its present phase. I am not one of those from whom the world waits for counsel, said the pensioner, and I know not that mine would be advantageous to you in the light which men usually prize. Yet, if I were to give any, it would be that you should be gone hence. Gone hence, repeated Redcliffe, surprised. I tell you what I have hardly hitherto told to myself, that all my dreams, all my wishes hitherto have looked forward to precisely the juncture that seems now to be approaching. My dreaming childhood dreamt of this. If you know anything of me, you know how I sprung out of mystery, akin to none, a thing concocted out of the elements, without visible agency. How all through my boyhood I was alone, how I grew up without a root, yet continually longing for one, longing to be connected with somebody, and never feeling myself so. Yet there was ever a looking forward to this time at which I now found myself. If my next step were death, yet while the path seemed to lead toward a certainty of establishing me in connection with my race, I would take it. I have tried to keep down this yearning, to stifle it, annihilate it, by making a position for myself, by being my own fact. But I cannot overcome the natural horror of being a creature floating in the air, attached to nothing, ever this feeling that there is no reality in the life and fortunes, good or bad, of a being so unconnected. There is not even a grave, not a heap of dry bones, not a pinch of dust with which I can claim kindred, unless I find it here. This is sad, said the old man, this strong yearning and nothing to gratify it. Yet I warn you, do not seek its gratification here. There are delusions, snares, pitfalls in this life. I warn you, quit the search. No, said Redcliffe, I will follow the mysterious clue that seems to lead me on, and even now it pulls me one step further. How is that? Asked the old man. It leads me onward even as far as the threshold, across the threshold of yonder mansion, said Redcliffe. Step not across it. There is blood on that threshold, exclaimed the pensioner, a bloody footstep emerging. Take heed that there be not as bloody a one entering it. Pshaw, said Redcliffe, feeling the ridicule of the emotion into which he had been portrayed, as the old man's wilderness of demeanor made him feel that he was talking with a monomaniac. We are talking idly. I do but go in the common intercourse of society to see the old English residence, which, such is the unhappy obscurity of my position, I fancy, among 1,000 others, may have been that of my ancestors. Nothing is likely to come of it. My foot is not bloody, nor polluted with anything except the mud of the damp English soil. Yet go not in, persisted the old man. Yes, I must go, said Redcliffe determinedly, "and I will." Ashamed to have been moved to such idle utterances by anything that the old man could say, Redcliffe turned away, though he still heard the sad, half-uttered remonstrance of the old man, like a moan behind him, and wondered what strange fancy had taken possession of him. The effect which this opposition had upon him made him the more aware how much his heart was set upon this visit to the hall, how much he had counted upon being domiciliated there, what a wrench it would be to him to tear himself away without going into that mansion and penetrating all the mysteries wherewith his imagination, exercising itself upon the theme since the days of the old doctor's fireside talk, had invested it. In his agitation he wandered forth from the hospital, and passing through the village street found himself in the park of Braithwaite Hall, where he wandered for a space until his steps led him to a point whence the venerable hall appeared, with its limes and its oaks around it, its look of peace and aged repose and loveliness, its stately domesticity, so ancient, so beautiful, its mild, sweet simplicity. It seemed the ideal of home. The thought thrilled his bosom that this was his home, the home of the wild western wanderer who had gone away centuries ago and encountered strange chances and almost forgotten his origin, but still kept a clue to bring him back, and had now come back and found all the original emotions safe within him. It even seemed to him that by his kindred with those who had gone before, by the line of sensitive blood linking him with that final emigrant, he could remember all these objects, that tree hardly more venerable now than then, that clock tower still marking the elapsing time, that spire of the old church raising itself beyond. He spread out his arms in a kind of rapture and exclaimed, "Oh, home, my forefathers' home, I have come back to thee. The wanderer has come back." There was a slight stir near him, and on a mossy seat that was arranged to take advantage of the remarkably good point of view of the old hall, he saw Elsie sitting. She had her drawing materials with her and had probably been taking a sketch. Redcliffe was ashamed of having been overheard by anyone giving way to such idle passion as he had been betrayed into, and yet, in another sense, he was glad at least that something of his feeling, as yet unspoken to human being, was shared, and shared by her with whom alone of living beings he had any sympathies of old date, and whom he often thought of with feelings that drew him irresistibly towards her. "Elsie," he said, uttering for the first time the old name, "Providence makes you my confidant. We have recognized each other, though no word has passed between us. Let us speak now again with one another. How came you hither? What has brought us together again? Away with this strangeness that lurks between us. Let us meet as those who began life together, and whose life strings, being so early twisted in unison, cannot now be torn apart. "You are not wise," said Elsie in a faltering voice, "to break the restraint we have tacitly imposed upon ourselves. Do not let us speak further on this subject." "How strangely everything evades me!" exclaimed Redcliffe. "I seem to be in a land of enchantment, where I can get hold of nothing that lends me a firm support. There is no medium in my life between the most vulgar realities and the most vaporous fiction, too thin to breathe. Tell me, Elsie, how came you here? Why do you not meet me frankly? What is there to keep you apart from the oldest friend, I am bold to say, you have on earth? Are you an English girl? Are you one of our own New England maidens, with her freedom and her know-how and her force beyond anything that these demure and decorous damsels can know?" "This is wild," said Elsie, struggling for composure, yet strongly moved by the recollections that he brought up. "It is best that we should meet as strangers, and so part." "No," said Redcliffe, "the long past comes up with its memories, and yet it is not so powerful as the powerful present. We have met again. Our adventures have shown that Providence has designed a relation in my fate to yours. Elsie, are you lonely as I am?" "No," she replied. "I have bonds, ties, a life, a duty. I must live that life and do that duty. You have likewise, both. Do yours. Lead your own life like me." "Do you know, Elsie," he said, "whither that life is now tending?" "Whither?" said she, turning toward him. "To yonder hall," said he. She started up and clasped her hands about his arm. "No, no," she exclaimed, "go not thither. There is blood upon the threshold. Return. A dreadful fatality awaits you here." "Come with me, then," said he, "and I yield my purpose." "It cannot be," said Elsie. "Then I too tell you it cannot be," returned Redcliffe. The dialogue had reached this point when there came a step along the wood path. The branches rustled, and there was Lord Braithwaite, looking upon the pair with the ordinary slightly sarcastic glance with which he gazed upon the world. "A fine morning, fair lady and fair sir," said he. "We have few such, except in Italy." End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Katina Papadakis. Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So Redcliffe left the hospital, where he had spent many weeks of strange and not unhappy life, and went to accept the invitation of the Lord of Braithwaite Hall. It was with a thrill of strange delight, poignant almost to pain, that he found himself driving up to the door of the hall, and actually passing the threshold of the house. He looked, as he stepped over it, for the bloody footstep, with which the house had so long been associated in his imagination, but could nowhere see it. The footman ushered him into a hall, which seemed to be in the center of the building, and where, little as the autumn was advanced, a fire was nevertheless burning and glowing on the hearth, nor was its effect undesirable in the somewhat gloomy room. The servants had evidently received orders respecting the guest, for they ushered him at once to his chamber, which seemed not to be one of those bachelors' rooms, where, in an English mansion, young and single men are forced to be entertained with very bare and straitened accommodations, but a large, well, though antiquely and solemnly furnished room, with a curtained bed, and all manner of elaborate contrivances for repose, but the deep embrasures of the windows made it gloomy, with the little light that they admitted through their small panes. There must have been English attendants in this department of the household arrangements, at least, for nothing could exceed the exquisite nicety and finish of everything in the room, the cleanliness, the attention to comfort, amid antique aspects of furniture, the rich, deep preparations for repose. The servant told Redcliffe that his master had ridden out, and, adding that luncheon would be on the table at 2:00, left him, and Redcliffe sat some time, trying to make out and distinguish the feelings with which he found himself here, and realizing a lifelong dream. He ran back over all the legends which the doctor used to tell about this mansion, and wondered whether this old, rich chamber were the one where any of them had taken place, whether the shadows of the dead haunted here. But, indeed, if this were the case, the apartment must have been very much changed, antique though it looked, with the second, or third, or whatever other numbered arrangement, since those old days of tapestry hangings and rush-strewed floor. Otherwise, this stately and gloomy chamber was as likely as any other to have been the one where his ancestor appeared for the last time in the paternal mansion. Here he might have been the night before that mysterious, bloody footstep was left on the threshold, whence had arisen so many wild legends, and since the impression of which nothing certain had ever been known respecting that ill-fated man, nothing certain in England at least, and whose story was left so ragged and questionable even by all that he could add. Do what he could, Redcliffe still was not conscious of that deep home feeling which he had imagined he should experience when, if ever, he should come back to the old ancestral place. There was strangeness, a struggle within himself to get hold of something that escaped him, an effort to impress on his mind the fact that he was, at last, established at his temporary home in the place that he had so long looked forward to, and that this was the moment which he would have thought more interesting than any other in his life. He was strangely cold and indifferent, frozen up, as it were, and fancied that he would have cared little had he been to leave the mansion without so much as looking over the remaining part of it. At last he became weary of sitting and indulging this fantastic humor of indifference, and emerged from his chamber with the design of finding his way about the lower part of the house. The mansion had that delightful intricacy which can never be contrived, never be attained by design, but is the happy result of where many builders, many designs, many ages perhaps, have concurred in a structure, each pursuing his own design. Thus it was a house that you could go astray in, as in a city, and come to unexpected places, but never, until after much accustomance, go where you wished. So Redcliffe, although the great staircase and wide corridor by which he had been led to his room seemed easy to find, yet soon discovered that he was involved in an unknown labyrinth, where strange little bits of staircases led up and down, and where passages promised much in letting him out, but performed nothing. To be sure, the old English mansion had not much of the stateliness of one of Mrs. Radcliffe's castles, with their suites of rooms opening one into another, but yet its very domesticity, its look as if long ago it had been lived in, made it only the more ghostly, and so Redcliffe felt the more as if he were wandering through a homely dream. Sensible of the ludicrousness of his position, he once called aloud, but his voice echoed along the passages, sounding unwontedly to his ears, but arousing nobody. It did not seem to him as if he were going afar, but were bewildered round and round, within a very small compass, a predicament in which a man feels very foolish usually. As he stood at an old window, stone-mullioned, at the end of a passage into which he had come twice over, a door near him opened, and a personage looked out whom he had not before seen. It was a face of great keenness and intelligence, and not unpleasant to look at, though dark and sallow. The dress had something which Redcliffe recognized as clerical, though not exactly pertaining to the Church of England, a sort of arrangement of the vest and shirt-collar, and he had knee-breeches of black. He did not seem like an English clerical personage, however, for even in this little glimpse of him Redcliffe saw a mildness, gentleness, softness, and asking of leave in his manner, which he had not observed in persons so well assured of their position as the Church of England clergy. He seemed at once to detect Redcliffe's predicament, and came forward with a pleasant smile, speaking in good English, though with a somewhat foreign accent. "Ah, sir, you have lost your way. It is a labyrinthian house for its size, this old English hall, full of perplexity. Shall I show you to any point?" "Indeed, sir," said Redcliffe, laughing, "I hardly know whither I want to go, being a stranger, and yet knowing nothing of the public places of the house. To the library, perhaps, if you will be good enough to direct me thither." "Willingly, my dear sir," said the clerical personage, "the more easily, too, as my own quarters are close adjacent, the library being my province. Do me the favour to enter here." So saying, the priest ushered Redcliffe into an austere-looking, yet exceedingly neat study, as it seemed, on one side of which was an oratory, with a crucifix and other accommodations for Catholic devotion. Behind a white curtain there were glimpses of a bed, which seemed arranged on a principle of conventual austerity in respect to limits and lack of softness, but still there was in the whole austerity of the premises a certain character of restraint, poise, principle, which Redcliffe liked. A table was covered with books, many of them folios in an antique binding of parchment, and others were small, thick-set volumes, into which antique lore was rammed and compressed. Through an open door, opposite to the one by which he had entered, there was a vista of a larger apartment, with alcoves, a rather dreary-looking room, though a little sunshine came through a window at the further end, distained with colored glass. "Will you sit down in my little home?" said the courteous priest. "I hope we may be better acquainted, so allow me to introduce myself. I am Father Angelo, domestic chaplain to his lordship. You, I know, are the American diplomatic gentleman, from whom his lordship has been expecting a visit." Redcliffe bowed. "I am most happy to know you," continued the priest. "Ah, you have a happy country, most Catholic, most recipient of all that is outcast on earth. Men of my religion must ever bless it." "It certainly ought to be remembered to our credit," replied Redcliffe, "that we have shown no narrow spirit in this matter, and have not, like other Protestant countries, rejected the good that is found in any man on account of his religious faith. American statesmanship comprises Jew, Catholic, all." After this pleasant little acknowledgment, there ensued a conversation having some reference to books, for though Redcliffe, of late years, had known little of what deserves to be called literature, having found political life as much estranged from it as it is apt to be with politicians, yet he had early snuffed the musty fragrance of the doctor's books, and had learned to love its atmosphere. At the time he left college, he was just at the point where he might have been a scholar, but the active tendencies of American life had interfered with him, as with thousands of others, and drawn him away from pursuits which might have been better adapted to some of his characteristics than the one he had adopted. The priest gently felt and touched around his pursuits, and finding some remains of classic culture, he kept up a conversation on these points, showing him the possessions of the library in that department, where, indeed, were some treasures that he had discovered, and which seemed to have been collected at least a century ago. "Generally, however," observed he as they passed from one dark alcove to another, "the library is of little worth, except to show how much of living truth each generation contributes to the botheration of life, and what a public benefactor a bookworm is, after all. There now, did you ever happen to see one? Here is one that I have watched at work, some time past, and have not thought it worth while to stop him." Redcliffe looked at the learned little insect, who was eating a strange sort of circular trench into an old book of scholastic Latin, which probably only he had ever devoured, at least ever found to his taste. The insect seemed in excellent condition, fat with learning, having doubtless got the essence of the book into himself. But Redcliffe was still more interested in observing in the corner a great spider, which really startled him, not so much for its own terrible aspect, though that was monstrous, as because he seemed to see in it the very great spider which he had known in his boyhood, that same monster that had been the doctor's familiar, and had been said to have had an influence in his death. He looked so startled that Father Angelo observed it. "Do not be frightened," said he, "though I allow that a brave man may be well afraid of a spider, and that the bravest of the brave need not blush to shudder at this one. There is a great mystery about this spider. No one knows whence he came, nor how long he has been here. The library was very much shut up during the time of the last inheritor of the estate, and had not been thoroughly examined for some years when I opened it, and swept some of the dust away from its old alcoves. I myself was not aware of this monster until the lapse of some weeks, when I was startled at seeing him one day, as I was reading an old book here. He dangled down from the ceiling, by the cordage of his web, and positively seemed to look into my face." "He is of the species Condytus," said Redcliffe. "A rare spider seldom seen out of the tropic regions." "You are learned, then, in spiders," observed the priest, surprised. "I could almost make oath, at least, that I have known this ugly specimen of his race," observed Redcliffe. "A very dear friend, now deceased, to whom I owed the highest obligations, was studious of spiders, and his chief treasure was one the very image of this." "How strange," said the priest. "There has always appeared to me to be something uncanny in spiders. I should be glad to talk further with you on this subject. Several times I have fancied a strange intelligence in this monster, but I have natural horror of him, and therefore refrain from interviews." "You do wisely, sir," said Redcliffe. "His powers and purposes are questionably beneficent at best." In truth, the many-legged monster made the old library ghostly to him by the associations which it summoned up, and by the idea that it was really the identical one that had seemed so stuffed with poison in the lifetime of the doctor, and at that so distant spot. Yet on reflection it appeared not so strange, for the old doctor's spider, as he had heard him say, was one of an ancestral race that he had brought from beyond the sea. They might have been preserved, for ages possibly, in this old library, whence the doctor had perhaps taken his specimen, and possibly the one now before him was the sole survivor. It hardly, however, made the monster any the less hideous to suppose that this might be the case, and to fancy the poison of old times condensed into this animal, who might have sucked the diseases, moral and physical, of all this family into him, and to have made himself their demon. He questioned with himself whether it might not be well to crush him at once, and so perhaps do away with the evil of which he was the emblem. "I felt a strange disposition to crush this monster at first," remarked the priest, as if he knew what Redcliffe was thinking of. "A feeling that in so doing I should get rid of a mischief, but then he is such a curious monster. You cannot long look at him without coming to the conclusion that he is indestructible." "Yes, and to think of crushing such a deep-boweled monster," said Redcliffe, shuddering. "It is too great a catastrophe." During this conversation, in which he was so deeply concerned, the spider withdrew himself, and hand over hand ascended to a remote and dusky corner, where was his hereditary abode. "Shall I be likely to meet Lord Braithwaite here in the library?" asked Redcliffe, when the fiend had withdrawn himself. "I have not yet seen him since my arrival." "I trust," said the priest with great courtesy, "that you are aware of some peculiarities in his lordship's habits, which imply nothing in detriment to the great respect which he pays all his few guests, and which I know he is especially desirous to pay to you. I think that we shall meet him at lunch, which, though an English institution, his lordship has adopted very readily." "I should hope," said Redcliffe, willing to know how far he might be expected to comply with the peculiarities, which might prove to be eccentricities, of his host, "that my presence here will not be too greatly at variance with his lordship's habits, whatever they may be. I came hither, indeed, on the pledge that, as my host would not stand in my way, so neither would I in his." "That is the true principle," said the priest, "and here comes his lordship in person to begin the practice of it." End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jessica Hendra. Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Section 22. Chapter 22. Lord Braithwaite came into the principal door of the library as the priest was speaking, and stood a moment just upon the threshold, looking keenly out of the stronger light into this dull and darksome apartment, as if unable to see perfectly what was within, or rather, as Redcliffe fancied, trying to discover what was passing between those two. And indeed, as when a third person comes suddenly upon two who are talking of him, the two generally evince in their manner some consciousness of the fact. So it was in this case, with Redcliffe at least, although the priest seemed perfectly undisturbed, either through practice of concealment or because he had nothing to conceal. His lordship, after a moment's pause, came forward, presenting his hand to Redcliffe, who shook it, and not without a certain cordiality, till he perceived that it was the left hand, when he probably intimated some surprise by a change of manner. "I am an awkward person," said his lordship. "The left hand, however, is nearest the heart, so be assured I mean no discourtesy." "The senior ambassador and myself," observed the priest, "have had a most interesting conversation, to me at least, about books and bookworms, spiders and other congruous matters, and I find His Excellency has heretofore made acquaintance with a great spider bearing strong resemblance to the hermit of our library." "Indeed," said his lordship, "I was not aware that America had yet enough of age and old misfortune, crime, sordidness, that accumulate with it, to have produced spiders like this. Had he sucked into himself all the noisomeness of your heat?" Redcliffe made some slight answer that the spider was a sort of pet of an old virtuoso to whom he owed many obligations in his boyhood, and the conversation turned from this subject to others suggested by topics of the day and place. His lordship was affable, and Redcliffe could not, it must be confessed, see anything to justify the prejudices of the neighbours against him. Indeed, he was inclined to attribute them, in great measure, to the narrowness of the English view, to those insular prejudices which have always prevented them from fully appreciating what differs from their own habits. At lunch, which was soon announced, the party of three became very pleasant and sociable, his lordship drinking a light Italian red wine, and recommending it to Redcliffe, who, however, was English enough to prefer some bitter ale, while the priest contented himself with pure water, which is, in truth, a less agreeable drink in chill, moist England than in any country we are acquainted with. "You must make yourself quite at home here," said his lordship as they rose from table. "I am not a good host, nor a very genial man, I believe. I can do little to entertain you, but here is the house and the grounds at your disposal. Horses in the stable, guns in the hall. Here is Father Angelo good at chess. There is the library. Pray make the most of them all, and if I can contribute in any way to your pleasure, let me know." All this certainly seemed cordial, and the manner in which it was said seemed in accordance with the spirit of the words. And yet, whether the fault was in anything of morbid suspicion in Redcliffe's nature, or whatever it was, it did not have the effect of making him feel welcome, which almost every Englishman has the natural faculty of producing on a guest, when once he has admitted him beneath his roof. It might be in great measure his face, so thin and refined, and intellectual without feeling, his voice, which had melody, but not heartiness, his manners, which were not simple by nature, but by art. Whatever it was, Redcliffe found that Lord Braithwaite did not call for his own naturalness and simplicity, but his art, and felt that he was inevitably acting a part in his intercourse with him, that he was on his guard, playing a game, and yet he did not wish to do this. But there was a mobility, a subtleness in his nature, an unconscious tact, which the mode of life and of mixing with men in America fosters and perfects, that made this sort of finesse inevitable to him, with any but a natural character, with whom, on the other hand, Redcliffe could be as fresh and natural as any Englishman of them all. Redcliffe spent the time between lunch and dinner in wandering about the grounds, from which he had hitherto felt himself debarred by motives of delicacy. It was a most interesting ramble to him, coming to trees which his ancestor, who went to America, might have climbed in his boyhood, might have sat beneath, with his lady love, in his youth. Dear there were, the descendants of those which he had seen, old stone stiles which his foot had trodden. The sombre, clouded light of the day fell down upon this scene, which in its verdure, its luxuriance of vegetable life, was purely English, cultivated to the last extent without losing the nature out of a single thing. In the course of his walk, he came to the spot where he had been so mysteriously wounded on his first arrival in this region, and examining the spot, he was startled to see that there was a path leading to the other side of a hedge, and this path, which led to the house, had brought him here. Musing upon this mysterious circumstance, and how it should have happened in so orderly a country as England, so tamed and subjected to civilization, an incident to happen in an English park, which seemed better suited to the Indian-haunted forests of the wilder parts of his own land, and how no researches which the warden had instituted had served in the smallest degree to develop the mystery. He clambered over the hedge and followed the footpath. It plunged into dells and emerged from them, led through scenes which seemed those of old romances, and at last, by these devious ways, began to approach the old house, which, with its many grey gables, put on a new aspect from this point of view. Redcliffe admired its venerableness anew, the ivy that overran parts of it, the marks of age, and wondered at the firmness of the institutions, which, through all the changes that come to man, could have kept this house the home of one lineal race for so many centuries, so many that the absence of his own branch from it seemed but a temporary visit to foreign parts, from which he was now returned, to be again at home by the old hearthstone. "But what do I mean to do?" said he to himself, stopping short and still looking at the old house. "Am I ready to give up all the actual life before me for the sake of taking up with what I feel to be a less developed state of human life? Would it not be better for me to depart now, to turn my back on this flattering prospect? I am not fit to be here. I, so strongly susceptible of a newer, more stirring life than these men lead. I, who feel that, whatever the thought and cultivation of England may be, my own countrymen have gone forward a long, long march beyond them, not intellectually, but in a way that gives them a further start. if I come back hither with the purpose to make myself an Englishman, especially an Englishman of rank and hereditary estate, then for me America has been discovered in vain, and the great spirit that has been breathed into us is in vain. And I am false to it all? But again came silently swelling over him like a flood all that ancient peace and quietude and dignity which looked so stately and beautiful as brooding round the old house, all that blessed order of ranks, that sweet superiority, and yet with no disclaimer of common brotherhood that existed between the English gentleman and his inferiors, all that delightful intercourse, so sure of pleasure, so safe from rudeness, lowness, unpleasant rubs, that exists between gentlemen and gentlemen, where in public affairs all are essentially of one mind, or seem so to an American politician, accustomed to the fierce conflicts of our embittered parties, where life was made so enticing, so refined, and yet with a sort of homeliness that seemed to show that all its strength was left behind, that seeming taking in of all that was desirable in life, and all its grace and beauty, yet never giving life a hard enamel of over-refinement. What could there be in the wild, harsh, ill-conducted American approach to civilization which could compare with this? What to compare with this juiciness and richness? What other men had ever got so much out of life as the polished and wealthy Englishman of today? What higher part was to be acted than seemed to lie before him, if he willed to accept it? He resumed his walk, and drawing near the manor house, found that he was approaching another entrance than that which had at first admitted him. A very pleasant entrance it was, beneath a porch of antique form, and ivy-clad, hospitable and inviting, and it being the approach from the grounds, it seemed to be more appropriate to the residents of the house than the other one. Drawing near, Redcliffe saw that a flight of steps ascended within the porch, old-looking, much worn, and nothing is more suggestive of long time than a flight of worn steps. It must have taken so many souls through so many years to make an impression. Judging from the make of the outside of the edifice, Redcliffe thought he could make out the way from the porch to the hall and library, so he determined to enter this way. There had been, as was not unusual, a little shower of rain during the afternoon, and as Redcliffe came close to the steps, they were glistening with the wet. The stones were whitish, like marble, and one of them bore on it a token that made him pause, while a thrill-like terror ran through his system. For it was the mark of a footstep, very decidedly made out and red like blood, the bloody footstep, the mark of a foot which seemed to have been slightly impressed into the rock, as if it had been a soft substance, at the same time sliding a little and gushing with blood. The glistening moisture of which we have spoken made it appear as if it were just freshly stamped there, and it suggested to Redcliffe's fancy the idea that, impressed more than 2 centuries ago, there was some charm connected with the mark which kept it still fresh, and would continue to do so to the end of time. It was well that there was no spectator there, for the American would have blushed to have it known how much this old traditionary wonder had affected his imagination. But indeed, it was as old as any bugbear of his mind, as any of those bugbears and private terrors which grow up with people and make the dreams and nightmares of childhood, and the fever images of mature years, till they haunt the deliriums of the dying bed, and after that possibility are either realized or known no more. The doctor's strange story vividly recurred to him, and all the horrors which he had since associated with this trace, and it seemed to him as if he had now struck upon a bloody track, and as if there were other tracks of this supernatural foot which he was bound to search out, removing the dust of ages that had settled on them, the moss and deep grass that had grown over them, the forest leaves that might have fallen on them in America, marking out the pathway till the pedestrian lay down in his grave. The foot was issuing from, not entering into, the house. Whoever had impressed it, or on whatever occasion, he had gone forth, and doubtless to return no more. Redcliffe was impelled to place his own foot on the track, and the action, as it were, suggested in itself strange ideas of what had been the state of mind of the man who planted it there. And he felt a strange, vague, yet strong surmise of some agony, some terror and horror that had passed here, and would not fade out of the spot. While he was in these musings, he saw Lord Braithwaite looking at him through the glass of the porch with fixed, curious eyes, and a smile on his face. On perceiving that Redcliffe was aware of his presence, he came forth, without appearing in the least disturbed. "What think you of the bloody footstep?" asked he. "It seems to me undoubtedly," said Redcliffe, stooping to examine it more closely, "a good thing to make a legend out of, and, like most legendary lore, not capable of bearing close examination. I should decidedly say that the bloody footstep is a natural reddish stain in the stone." "Do you think so, indeed?" rejoined his lordship. "It may be. But in that case, if not the record of an actual deed, of a foot stamped down there in guilt and agony, and oozing out with unwipeable blood, we may consider it as prophetic, as foreboding, from the time when the stone was squared and smoothed, and laid at this threshold, that a fatal footstep was really to be impressed here." "It is an ingenious supposition," said Redcliffe. "But is there any sure knowledge that the prophecy you suppose has yet been fulfilled?" "If not, it might yet be in the future," said Lord Braithwaite. "But I think there are enough in the records of this family to prove that there did one cross this threshold in a bloody agony, who has since returned no more. Great seekings, I have understood, have been had throughout the world for him, or for any sign of him, but nothing satisfactory has been heard." "And it is now too late to expect it," observed the American. "Perhaps not," replied the nobleman, with a glance that Redcliffe thought had peculiar meaning in it. "Ah, it is very curious to see what turnings up there are in this world of old circumstances that seem buried forever. How things come back, like echoes that have rolled away among the hills and been seemingly hushed forever. We cannot tell when a thing is really dead. It comes to life, perhaps in its old shape, perhaps in a new, an unexpected one, so that nothing really vanishes out of the world. I wish it did." The conversation now ceased, and Redcliffe entered the house, where he amused himself for some time in looking at the ancient hall with its gallery, its armour, and its antique fireplace, on the hearth of which burned a genial fire. He wondered whether in that fire was the continuance of that custom which the doctor's legend spoke of, and that the flame had been kept up there 200 years, in expectation of the wanderer's return. It might be so, although the climate of England made it a natural custom enough, in a large and damp old room, into which many doors opened, both from the exterior and interior of the mansion. But it was pleasant to think the custom a traditionary one, and to fancy that a booted figure, enveloped in a cloak, might still arrive and fling open the veiling cloak, throw off the sombre and drooping brimmed hat, and show features that were similar to those seen in pictured faces on the walls. Was he himself in another guise? As Lord Braithwaite had been saying, that long expected one? Was his the echoing tread that had been heard so long through the ages, so far through the wide world, approaching the blood-stained threshold? With such thoughts, or dreams, for they were hardly sincerely enough entertained to be called thoughts, Redcliffe spent the day, a strange, delicious day, in spite of the sombre shadows that enveloped it. He fancied himself strangely wonted already to the house, as if his every part and peculiarity had at once fitted into its nooks and corners and crannies. But indeed his mobile nature and active fancy were not entirely to be trusted in this matter. It was perhaps his American faculty of making himself at home anywhere that he mistook for the feeling of being particularly at home here. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jessica Hendra. Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Redcliffe was now established in the great house, which had been so long and so singularly an object of interest with him. With his customary impressibility by the influence around him, he began to take in the circumstances, and to understand them by more subtle tokens than he could well explain to himself. There was the steward, or whatever was his precise office, so quiet, so subdued, so nervous, so strange. What had been this man's history? What was now the secret of his daily life? There he was, creeping stealthily up and down the staircases, and about the passages of the house, always as if he were afraid of meeting somebody. On seeing Redcliffe in the house, the latter fancied that the man expressed a kind of interest in his face, but whether pleasure or pain he could not well tell. Only he sometimes found that he was contemplating him from a distance, or from the obscurity of the room in which he sat, or from a corridor, while he smoked his cigar on the lawn. A great part, if not the whole of this, he imputed to his knowledge of Redcliffe's connections with the doctor. But yet this hardly seemed sufficient to account for the pertinacity with which the old man haunted his footsteps. The poor nervous old thing, always near him, or often unexpectedly so, and yet apparently not very willing to hold conversation with him, having nothing of importance to say. "Mr. Ormskirk," said Redcliffe to him, a day or two after the commencement of his visit, "how many years have you now been in this situation?"
"Oh, sir, ever since the doctor's departure for America," said Ormskirk. "Now 35 years, 5 months, and 3 days.
"A long time," said Redcliffe, smiling, "and you seem to keep the account of it very accurately."
"A very long time, your honour," said Ormskirk. "So long that I seem to have lived one life before it began, and I cannot think of any life than just what I had. My life was broken off short in the midst, and what belonged to the earlier part of it was another man's life. This is mine."
"It might be a pleasant life enough, I should think, in this fine old hall," said Redcliffe. "Rather monotonous, however. Would you not like a relaxation of a few days? A pleasure trip in all these 35 years? You old Englishmen are so sturdily faithful to one thing. You do not resemble my countrymen in that."
"Oh, none of them ever lived in an old mansion house like this," replied Ormskirk. "They do not know the sort of habits that a man gets here. They do not know my business either, nor any man's here."
"Is your master then so difficult?" said Redcliffe.
"My master? Who was speaking of him?"
said the old man, as if surprised.
"Ah, I was thinking of Dr. Grimshawe. He was my master, you know."
And Redcliffe was again inconceivably struck with the strength of the impression that was made on the poor old man's mind by the character of the old doctor, so that, after 30 years of other service, he still felt him to be the master, and could not in the least release himself from those earlier bonds. He remembered a story that the doctor used to tell of his once recovering a hanged person, and more came to the conclusion that this was the man, and that, as the doctor had said, this hold of a strong mind over a weak one, strengthened by the idea that he had made him, had subjected the man to him in a kind of slavery that embraced the soul. And then again, the lord of the estate interested him greatly, and not unpleasantly. He compared what he seemed to be now with what, according to all reports, he had been in the past, and could make nothing of it, nor reconcile the two characters in the least. It seemed as if the estate were possessed by a devil, a foul and melancholy fiend, who resented the attempted possession of others by subjecting them to himself. One had turned from quiet and sober habits to reckless dissipation. Another had turned from the usual gaiety of life to recluse habits, and both apparently by the same influence. At least, so it appeared to Redcliffe, as he insulated their story from all other circumstances, and looked at them by one light. He even thought that he felt a similar influence coming over himself, even in this little time that he had spent here. Gradually, should this be his permanent residence, and not so very gradually either, there would come its own individual mode of change over him. That quick, suggestive mind would gather the moss and lichens of decay. Palsy of its powers would probably be the form it would assume. He looked back through the vanished years to the time which he had spent with the old doctor, and he felt unaccountably as if the mysterious old man were yet ruling him, as he did in his boyhood, as if his inscrutable, inevitable eye were upon him in all his movements, nay, as if he had guided every step that he took in coming hither, and were stalking mistily before him, leading him about. He sometimes would gladly have given up all these wild and enticing prospects, these dreams that had occupied him so long, if he could only have gone away and looked back upon the house, its inmates, and his own recollections no more. But there came a fate and took the shape of the old doctor's apparition, holding him back. And then, too, the thought of Elsie had much influence in keeping him quietly here. Her natural sunshine was the one thing that, just now, seemed to have a good influence upon the world. She, too, was evidently connected with this place, and with the fate, whatever it might be, that awaited him here. The doctor, the ruler of his destiny, had provided her as well as all the rest, and from his grave, or wherever he was, he still seemed to bring them together. So here in this darkened dream he waited for what should come to pass, and daily, when he sat down in the dark old library, it was with the thought that this day might bring to a close the doubt amid which he lived, might give him the impetus to go forward. In such a state, no doubt, the witchcraft of the place was really to be recognized. The old witchcraft, too, of the doctor, which he had escaped by the quick ebullition of youthful spirit, long ago, while the doctor lived, but which had been stored up till now, till an influence that remained latent for years had worked out in active disease. He held himself open for intercourse with the lord of the mansion, and intercourse of a certain nature they certainly had, but not of the kind which Redcliffe desired. They talked together of politics, of the state of the relations between England and America, of the court to which Redcliffe was accredited. Sometimes Redcliffe tried to lead the conversation to the family topics, nor, in truth, did Lord Braithwaite seem to decline his lead, although it was observable that very speedily the conversation would be found turned upon some other subject, to which it had swerved aside by subtle, underhand movements. Yet Redcliffe was not the less determined, and at no distant period, to bring up the subject on which his mind dwelt so much, and have it fairly discussed between them. He was sometimes a little frightened at the position and circumstances in which he found himself. A great disturbance there was in his being, the causes of which he could not trace. It had an influence on his dreams, through which the doctor seemed to pass continually, and when he awoke, it was often with the sensation that he had just the moment before been holding conversation with the old man, and that the latter, with that gesture of power that he remembered so well, had been impressing some command upon him. But what that command was, he could not possibly call to mind. He wandered among the dark passages of the house, and up its antique staircases, as if expecting at every turn to meet someone who would have the word of destiny to say to him. When he went forth into the park, it was as if to hold an appointment with one who had promised to meet him there, and he came slowly back, lingering and loitering, because this expected one had not yet made himself visible, yet plucked up a little alacrity as he drew near the house, because the communicant might have arrived in his absence, and be waiting for him in the dim library. It seemed as if he was under a spell. He could neither go away nor rest. Nothing but dreams, troubled dreams. He had ghostly fears, as if someone were near him, whom he could not make out, stealing behind him, and starting away when he was impelled to turn round. A nervousness that his healthy temperament had never before permitted him to be the victim of assailed him now. He could not help imputing it partly to the influence of the generations who had left a portion of their individual human nature in the house, which had become magnetic by them, and could not rid itself of their presence in one sense, though, in another, they had borne it as far off as to where the grey tower of the village church rose above their remains. Again, he was frightened to perceive what a hold the place was getting upon him, how the tendrils of the ivy seemed to hold him and would not let him go, how natural and homelike, grim and somber as they were, the old doorways and apartments were becoming, how in no place that he had ever known had he had such a home-like feeling. To be sure, poor fellow, he had no earlier home except the almshouse, where his recollection of a fireside crowded by grim old women and pale, sickly children of course never allowed him to have the reminiscences of a private domestic home. But then there was the doctor's home by the graveyard, and little Elsie, his constant playmate. No, even those recollections did not hold him like this heavy present circumstance. How should he ever draw himself away? No, the proud and vivid and active prospects that had heretofore spread themselves before him, the striving to conquer, the struggle, the victory, the defeat, if such it was to be, the experiences for good or ill, the life, all possibility of these was passing from him. All that hearty, earnest contest or communion of man with man, and leaving him nothing but this great, somber shade, this brooding of the old family mansion, with its dreary ancestral hall, its moldy dignity, its life of the past, its fettering honor, which to accept must bind him hand and foot, as respects all effort, such as he had trained himself for, such as his own country offered. It was not any value for these, as it seemed to Redcliffe, but a witchcraft, an indefinable spell, a something that he could not define, that enthralled him, and was now doing a work on him analogous to, though different from, that which was wrought on Ormskirk and all the other inhabitants, high and low, of this old mansion. He felt greatly interested in the master of the mansion, although perhaps it was not from anything in his nature, but partly because he conceived that he himself had a controlling power over his fortunes, and likewise from the vague perception of this before-mentioned trouble in him. It seemed, whatever it might be, to have converted an ordinary superficial man of the world into a being that felt and suffered inwardly, had pangs, fears, a conscience, a sense of unseen things. It seemed as if underneath this manor house were the entrance to the cave of Trophonius, one visit to which made a man sad forever after, and that Lord Braithwaite had been there once, or perhaps went nightly, or at any hour, or the mansion itself was like dark colored experience, the reality, the point of view where things were seen in their true lights, the true world, all outside of which was delusion, and here, dreamlike as its structures seemed, the absolute truth. All those that lived in it were getting to be a brotherhood, and he among them, and perhaps before the blood-stained threshold would grow up an impassable barrier, which would cause himself to sit down in dreary quiet like the rest of them. Redcliffe, as has been intimated, had an unavowed to himself, suspicion that the master of the house cherished no kindly purpose towards him. He had an indistinct feeling of danger from him. He would not have been surprised to know that he was concocting a plot against his life, and yet he did not think that Lord Braithwaite had the slightest hostility towards him. It might make the thing more horrible, perhaps, but it has been often seen in those who poison for the sake of interest, without feelings of personal malevolence, that they do it as kindly as the nature of the thing will permit. They possibly may even have a certain degree of affection for their victims, enough to induce them to make the last hours of life sweet and pleasant, to wind up the fever of life with a double supply of enjoyable throbs, to sweeten and delicately flavor the cup of death that they offer to the lips of him whose life is inconsistent with some stated necessity of their own. Dear friend, such a one might say to the friend whom he reluctantly condemned to death, think not that there is any base malice, any desire of pain to thee, that actuates me in this thing. Heaven knows, I earnestly wish thy good, but I have well considered the matter, more deeply than thou hast, and have found that it is essential that one thing should be, and essential to that thing that thou, my friend, shouldst die. Is that a doom which even thou wouldst object to with such an end to be answered? Thou art innocent. Thou art not a man of evil life. The worst thing that can come of it, so far as thou art concerned, would be a quiet, endless repose in yonder churchyard, among dust of thy ancestry, with the English violets growing over thee there, and the green, sweet grass, which thou wilt not scorn to associate with thy dissolving elements, remembering that thy forefather owed a debt for his own birth and growth to this English soil, and paid it not, consigned himself to that rough soil of another clime, under the forest leaves. Pay it, dear friend, without repining, and leave me to battle a little longer with this troublesome world, and in a few years to rejoin thee, and talk quietly over this matter which we are now arranging. How slight a favour, then, for one friend to do another, will seem this that I seek of thee. Redcliffe smiled to himself as he thus gave expression to what he really half fancied were Lord Braithwaite's feelings and purposes towards him, and he felt them in the kindness and sweetness of his demeanour, and his evident wish to make him happy, combined with his own subtle suspicion of some design with which he had been invited here, or which had grown up since he came. Whoever has read Italian history must have seen such instances of this poisoning without malice or personal ill-feeling. His own pleasant, companionable, perhaps noble traits and qualities may have made a favourable impression on Lord Braithwaite, and perhaps he regretted the necessity of acting as he was about to do, but could not therefore weakly relinquish his deliberately formed design. And on his part, Redcliffe bore no malice towards Lord Braithwaite, but felt really a kindly interest in him. And could he have made him happy at any less cost than his own life, or dearest interests, would perhaps have been glad to do so. He sometimes felt inclined to remonstrate with him in a friendly way, to tell him that his intended course was not likely to lead to a good result, that they had better try to arrange the matter on some other basis, and perhaps he would not find the American so unreasonable as he supposed. All this, it will be understood, were the mere dreamy suppositions of Redcliffe, in the idleness and languor of the old mansion, letting his mind run at will, and following it into dim caves, whither it tended. He did not actually believe anything of all this, unless it be a lawyer, or a policeman, or some very vulgar natural order of mind. No man really suspects another of crime. It is the hardest thing in the world for a noble nature, the hardest and the most shocking, to be convinced that a fellow being is going to do a wrong thing, and the consciousness of one's own inviolability renders it still more difficult to believe that oneself is to be the object of the wrong. What he had been fancying looked to him like a romance. The strange part of the matter was what suggested such a romance in regard to his kind and hospitable host, who seemed to exercise the hospitality of England with a kind of refinement and pleasant piquancy that came from his Italian mixture of blood. Was there no spiritual whisper here? So the time wore on, and Redcliffe began to be sensible that he must soon decide upon the course that he was to take, for his diplomatic position waited for him, and he could not loiter many days more away in this half-delicious, half-painful reverie, and quiet in the midst of his struggling life. He was yet as undetermined what to do as ever, or, if we may come down to the truth, he was perhaps loath to acknowledge to himself the determination that he had actually formed. One day at dinner, which now came on after candlelight, he and Lord Braithwaite sat together at table as usual, while Ormskirk waited at the sideboard. It was a wild, gusty night, in which an autumnal breeze of later autumn seemed to have gone astray and come into September intrusively. The two friends, for such we may call them, had spent a pleasant day together, wandering in the grounds, looking at the old house at all points, going to the church, and examining the cross-legged stone statues. They had ridden, too, and taken a great deal of healthful exercise, and had now that pleasant sense of just weariness enough, which it is the boon of the climate of England to incite and permit men to take. Redcliffe was in one of his most genial moods, and Lord Braithwaite seemed to be the same, so kindly they were both disposed to one another, that the American felt that he might not longer refrain from giving his friend some light upon the character in which he appeared, or in which, at least, he had it at his option to appear. Lord Braithwaite might or might not know it already, but at all events it was his duty to tell him, or to take his leave, having thus far neither gained nor sought anything from their connection which would tend to forward his pursuit, should he decide to undertake it. When the cheerful fire, the rare wine, and the good fare had put them both into a good physical state, Redcliffe said to Lord Braithwaite, "There is a matter upon which I have been some time intending to speak to you." Braithwaite nodded. "A subject," continued he, "of interest to both of us. Has it ever occurred to you, from the identity of name, that I may be really what we have jokingly assumed me to be, a relation?" "It has," said Lord Braithwaite, readily enough. "The family would be proud to acknowledge such a kinsman, whose abilities and political rank would add a public lustre that it has long wanted." Redcliffe bowed and smiled. "You know, I suppose, the annals of your house," he continued, "and have heard how, 2 centuries ago, or somewhat less, there was an ancestor who mysteriously disappeared. He was never seen again. There were tales of private murder, out of which 100 legends have come down to these days, as I have myself found, though most of them in so strange a shape that I should hardly know them, had I not myself a clue." "I have heard some of these legends," said Lord Braithwaite. "But did you ever hear among them," asked Redcliffe, "that the lost ancestor did not really die, was not murdered, but lived long, though in another hemisphere, lived long and left heirs behind him?" "There is such a legend," said Lord Braithwaite. "Left posterity," continued Redcliffe, "a representative of whom is alive at this day?" "That I have not known, though I might conjecture something like it," said Braithwaite. The coolness with which he took this perplexed Redcliffe. He resolved to make trial at once, whether it were possible to move him. "And I have reason to believe," he added, "that that representative is myself. Should that prove to be the case, you are welcome back to your own," said Lord Braithwaite quietly. "It will be a very remarkable case, if the proofs for 200 years, or thereabouts, can be so distinctly made out as to nullify the claim of one whose descent is undoubted. Yet it is certainly not impossible. I suppose it would hardly be fair in me to ask what are your proofs, and whether I may see them." "The documents are in the hands of my agents in London," replied Redcliffe, "and seem to be ample, among them being a certified genealogy from the first immigrant downward, without a break, a declaration of 2 men of note among the first settlers, certifying that they knew the first immigrant, under a change of name, to be the eldest son of the house of Braithwaite, full proofs, at least, on that head." "You are a lawyer, I believe," said Braithwaite, "and know better than I what may be necessary to prove your claim. I will frankly own to you that I have heard, long ago, as long as when my connection with this hereditary property first began, that there was supposed to be an heir extant for a long course of years, and that there was no proof that that main line of the descent had ever become extinct. If these things had come fairly before me, and been represented to me with whatever force belongs to them, before my accession to the estate, these and other facts, which I have since become acquainted with, I might have deliberated on the expediency of coming to such a doubtful possession. The property, I assure you, is not so desirable that, taking all things into consideration, it has much increased my happiness. But now, here I am, having paid a price in a certain way, which you will understand, if you ever come into the property, a price of a nature that cannot possibly be refunded. It can hardly be presumed that I shall see your right a moment sooner than you make it manifest by law." "I neither expect nor wish it," replied Redcliffe, "nor, to speak frankly, am I quite sure that you will ever have occasion to defend your title, or to question mine. When I came hither to be your guest, it was almost with the settled purpose never to mention my proofs, nor to seek to make them manifest. That purpose is not, I may say, yet relinquished." "Yet I am to infer from your words that it is shaken," said Braithwaite. "You find the estate, then, so delightful? This life of the old manor house so exquisitely agreeable, this air so cheering, this moral atmosphere so invigorating?
that your scruples are about coming to an end? You think this life of an Englishman, this fair prospect of a title, so irresistibly enticing as to be worth more than your claim in behalf of your American birthright to a possible presidency? There was a sort of sneer in this, which Redcliffe did not know well how to understand, and there was a look on Braithwaite's face as he said it that made him think of a condemned soul who should be dressed in magnificent robes and surrounded with the mockery of state, splendor, and happiness, who, if he should be congratulated on his fortunate and blissful situation, would probably wear just such a look and speak in just that tone. He looked a moment in Braithwaite's face. "No," he replied, "I do not think that there is much happiness in it. A brighter, healthier, more useful, far more satisfactory, though tumultuous life would await me in my own country. But there is about this place a strange, deep, sad, brooding interest which possesses me and draws me to it and will not let me go. I feel as if, in spite of myself and my most earnest efforts, I were fascinated by something in the spot, and must needs linger here and make it my home if I can. You shall be welcome. The old hereditary chair will be filled at last," said Braithwaite, pointing to the vacant chair. "Come, we will drink to you in a cup of welcome. Take the old chair now." In half frolic, Redcliffe took the chair. He called to Ormskirk to bring a bottle of a particularly exquisite Italian wine, known only to the most deeply skilled in the vintages of that country, and which, he said, was oftener heard of than seen. Oftener seen than tasted. Ormskirk put it on the table in its original glass, and Braithwaite filled Redcliffe's glass and his own, and raised the latter to his lips, with a frank expression of his mobile countenance. "May you have a secure possession of your estate," said he, "and live long in the midst of your possessions. To me, on the whole, it seems better than your American prospects." Redcliffe thanked him, and drank off the glass of wine, which was not very much to his taste, as new varieties of wine are apt not to be. All the conversation that had passed had been in a free, careless sort of way, without apparently much earnestness in it, for they were both men who knew how to keep their more serious parts within them. But Redcliffe was glad that the explanation was over, and that he might now remain at Braithwaite's table, under his roof, without that uneasy feeling of treachery which, whether rightly or not, had haunted him hitherto. He felt joyous, and stretched his hand out for the bottle which Braithwaite kept near himself instead of passing it. "You do not yourself do justice to your own favourite wine," observed Redcliffe, seeing his host's full glass standing before him. "I have filled again," said Braithwaite carelessly, "but I know not that I shall venture to drink a second glass. It is a wine that does not bear mixture with other vintages, though of most genial and admirable qualities when taken by itself. Drink your own, however, for it will be a rare occasion indeed that would induce me to offer you another bottle of this rare stock." Redcliffe sipped his second glass, endeavoring to find out what was this subtle and peculiar flavor that hid itself so, and yet seemed on the point of revealing itself. It had, he thought, a singular effect upon his faculties, quickening and making them active, and causing him to feel as if he were on the point of penetrating rare mysteries, such as men's thoughts are always hovering round and always returning from. Some strange, vast, sombre, mysterious truth, which he seemed to have searched for long, appeared to be on the point of being revealed to him. A sense of something to come, something to happen, that had been waiting long, long to happen. An opening of doors, a drawing away of veils, a lifting of heavy, magnificent curtains, whose dark folds hung before a spectacle of awe. It was like the verge of the grave. Whether it was the exquisite wine of Braithwaite, or whatever it might be, the American felt a strange influence upon him, as if he were passing through the gates of eternity, and finding on the other side the revelation of some secret that had greatly perplexed him on this side. He thought that Braithwaite's face assumed a strange, subtle smile, not malicious, yet crafty, triumphant, and at the same time terribly sad. And with that perception his senses, his life, welled away, and left him in the deep ancestral chair at the board,
of Braithwaite. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne. When awake, author's note, Redcliffe lies in a dreamy state, thinking fantastically, as if he were one of the 7 sleepers. He does not yet open his eyes, but lies there in a maze. End of author's note. Or beginning to awake, he lay for some time in a maze, not a disagreeable one, but thoughts were running to and fro in his mind, all mixed and jumbled together, reminiscences of early days, even those that were pre-Adamite, referring, we mean, to those times in the almshouse, which he could not at ordinary times remember at all. But now there seemed to be visions of old women and men, and pallid girls, and little dirty boys, which could only be referred to that epoch. Also, and most vividly, there was the old doctor, with his sternness, his fierceness, his mystery, and all that happened since, playing phantasmagoria before his yet unclosed eyes, nor so mysterious was his state, did he know, when he should unclose those lids, where he should find himself. He was content to let the world go on in this way, as long as it would, and therefore did not hurry, but rather kept back the proofs of awakening, willing to look at the scenes that were unrolling for his amusement, as it seemed, and willing, too, to keep it uncertain whether he were not back in America and in his boyhood, and all other subsequent impressions a dream or a prophetic vision. But at length something stirring near him, or whether it stirred or whether he dreamed it, he could not quite tell, but the uncertainty impelled him at last to open his eyes and see whereabouts he was. Even then he continued in as much uncertainty as he was before, and lay with marvelous quietude in it, trying sluggishly to make the mystery out. It was in a dim twilight place, wherever it might be, a place of half-awakeness, where the outlines of things were not well defined, but it seemed to be a chamber, antique and vaulted, narrow and high, hung round with old tapestry. Whether it were morning or midday he could not tell, such was the character of the light, nor even where it came from, for there appeared to be no windows, and yet it was not apparently artificial light, nor light at all, indeed but a grey dimness. It was so like his own half-awake state that he lay in it a longer time, not inside it to finish his awaking, but in a languor, not disagreeable, yet hanging heavily upon him, like a dark pall. It was, in fact, as if he had been asleep for years or centuries, or till the last day was dawning, and then was collecting his thoughts in such slow fashion as would then be likely. Again that noise, a little, low, quiet sound as of one breathing somewhere near him. The whole thing was very much like an incident which introduced him to the hospital, and his first coming to his senses there. And he almost fancied that some such accident might again have happened to him, and that when his sight cleared he should again behold the venerable figure of the pensioner. With this idea he let his head steady itself, and it seemed to him that its dizziness must needs be the result of very long and deep sleep. What if it were the sleep of a century? What if all things that were extant when he went to sleep had passed away, and he was waking now in another epoch of time? Where was America, and the republic in which he hoped for such great things? Where England? Had she stood it better than the republic? Was the old hospital still in being, although the good warden must long since have passed out of its warm and pleasant life? And himself, how came he to be preserved? And what musty old nook had he been put away, where time neglected and death forgot him, until now he was to get up friendless, helpless, when new heirs had come to the estate he was on the point of laying claim to, and go onward through what remained of life? Would it not have been better to have lived with his contemporaries, and to be now dead and dust with them? Poor petty interests of a day, how slight! Again the noise, a little stir, a sort of quiet moan, or something he could not quite define, but it seemed, whenever he heard it, as if some fact thrust itself through the dream-work with which he was circumfused, something alien to his fantasies, yet not powerful enough to dispel them. It began to be irksome to him, this little sound of something near, and he thought, in the space of another 100 years, if it continued, he should have to arouse himself and see what it was. But indeed there was something so cheering in this long repose, this rest from all the troubles of earth, which it sometimes seemed as if only a churchyard bed would give us, that he wished the noise would let him alone. But his thoughts were gradually getting too busy for this slumberous state. He begun, perforce, to come nearer actuality. The strange question occurred to him, had any time at all passed? Was he not still sitting at Lord Braithwaite's table, having just now quaffed a second glass of that rare and curious Italian wine? Was it not affecting his head very strangely, so that he was put out of time, as it were? He would rally himself and try to set his head right with another glass. He must still be at table, for now he remembered he had not gone to bed at all. Author's note: Redcliffe must look at the old man quietly and dreamily, and without surprise, for a long time. End of author's note. Ah, the noise! He could not bear it. He would wake now, silence it, and then sleep again. In fact, he started to his feet, in puzzle and perplexity, and stood gazing around him with swimming brain. It was an antique room, which he did not at all recognize, and indeed in that dim twilight, which how he came he could not tell, he could scarcely discern what were its distinguishing marks. But he seemed to be sensible that in a high-backed chair at a little distance from him sat a figure in a long robe, a figure of a man with snow-white hair and a long beard, who seemed to be gazing at him, quietly, as if he had been gazing 100 years. I know not what it was, but there was an influence as if this old man belonged to some other age and category of man that he was now amongst. He remembered the old family legend of the existence of an ancestor 2 or 3 centuries in age. It is the old family personified, thought he. The old figure made no sign, but continued to sit gazing at him in so strangely still a manner that it made Redcliffe shiver with something that seemed like a fright. There was an aspect of long time about him, as if he had never been young, or so long ago as when the world was young along with him. He might be the demon of this old house, the representative of all that happened in it, the grief, the long languor, and the weariness of life, the deaths, gathering them all into himself, and figuring them in furrows, wrinkles, and white hairs, a being that might have been young when those old Saxon timbers were put together, with the oaks that were saplings when Caesar landed, and was in his maturity when the Conqueror came, and was now lapsing into extreme age when the 19th century was elderly. His garb might have been of any time, that long loose robe that enveloped him. Redcliffe remained in this way, gazing at this aged figure, at first without the least wonder, but calmly, as we feel in dreams, when, being in a land of enchantment, we take everything as if it were a matter of course, and feel, by the right of our own marvelous nature, on terms of equal kindred with all other marvels. So it was with him, when he first became aware of the old man, sitting there with that age-long regard directed towards him. But by degrees a sense of wonder had its will, and grew slowly at first in Redcliffe's mind, and almost twin-born with it, and growing piece by piece, there was a sense of awful fear, as his waking senses came slowly back to him. In the dreamy state he had felt no fear, but as a waking man, it was fearful to discover that the shadowy forms did not fly from his awaking eyes. He started at last to his feet from the low couch on which he had all this time been lying. "What are you?" exclaimed. "Where am I?" The old figure made no answer, nor could Redcliffe be quite sure that his voice had any effect upon it, though he fancied that it was shaken a little, as if his voice came to it from afar. But it continued to gaze at him, or at least to have its aged face turned towards him in the dim light, and the strange composure and unapproachableness was very frightening. As his manhood gathered about his heart, however, the American endeavored to shake off this besetting fear, or awe, or whatever it was, and to bring himself to a sense of waking things, to burst through the mist and delusive shows that bewildered him, and catch hold of a reality. He stamped upon the floor. It was solid stone, the pavement or oak so old and staunch that it resembled it. There was one firm thing, therefore, but the contrast between this and the slipperiness, the unaccountableness of the rest of his position, made him the more sensible of the latter. He made a step towards the old figure. Another. He was face to face with him, within a yard of distance. He saw the faint movement of the old man's breath. He saw it, through the twilight of the room, some glimmer of perception in his eyes. "Are you a living man?" asked Redcliffe, faintly and doubtfully. He mumbled, the old figure, some faint moaning sound that, if it were language at all, had all the edges and angles worn off it by decay. Unintelligible, except that it seemed to signify a faint mournfulness and complainingness of mood, and then held his peace, continuing to gaze as before. Redcliffe could not bear the awe that filled him, while he kept at a distance, and, coming desperately forward, he stood close to the old figure. He touched his robe, to see if it were real. He laid his hand upon the withered hand that held the staff, which he now recognized the very staff of the doctor's legend. His fingers touched a real hand, though bony and dry, as if it had been in the grave. "Then you are real," said Redcliffe doubtfully. The old figure seemed to have exhausted itself, its energies, what there were of them, in the effort of making the unintelligible communication already vouchsafed. Then he seemed to lapse out of consciousness, and not to know what was passing, or to be sensible that any person was near him. But Redcliffe was now resuming his firmness and daylight consciousness, even in the dimness. He ran over all that he had heard of the legend of the old house, rapidly considering whether there might not be something of fact in the legend of the undying man, whether as told or whispered in the chimney corners, it might not be an instance of the mysterious, the half-spiritual mode in which actual truths communicate themselves imperfectly through a medium that gives them the aspect of falsehood. Something in the atmosphere of the house made its inhabitants and neighbors dimly aware that there was a secret resident. It was by a language not audible, but of impression. There could not be such a secret in its recesses without making itself sensible. This legend of the undying one translated it to vulgar apprehension. He remembered those early legends told by the doctor in his childhood. He seemed imperfectly and doubtfully to see what was their true meaning, and how, taken aright, they had a reality, and were the craftily concealed history of his own wrongs, sufferings, and revenge. And this old man, who was he? He joined the warden's account of the family to the doctor's legends. He could not believe or take thoroughly in the strange surmise to which they led him, but by an irresistible impulse he acted on it. "Sir Edward Redcliffe!" he exclaimed. "Ha! Who speaks to me?" exclaimed the old man, in a startled voice, like one who hears himself called at an unexpected moment. "Sir Edward Redcliffe," repeated Redcliffe. "I bring you news of Norman Oglethorpe." Footnote: presumably the true name of Dr. Grimshawe. End footnote. "The villain, the tyrant! Mercy, mercy, save me!" cried the old man, in most violent emotion of terror and rage intermixed, that shook his old frame as if it would be shaken asunder. He stood erect, the picture of ghastly horror, as if he saw before him that stern face that had thrown a blight over his life, and so fearfully avenged, from youth to age, the crime that he had committed. The effect, the passion was too much. The terror with which it smote, the rage that accompanied it, blazed up for a moment with a fierce flame, then flickered and went out. He stood tottering. Redcliffe put out his hand to support him, but he sank down in a heap on the floor, as if a thing of dry bones had been suddenly loosened at the joints, and fell in a rattling heap. Footnote: this mysterious prisoner, Sir Edward Redcliffe, is not, of course, the Sir Edward who founded the hospital, but a descendant of that man who ruined Dr. Grimshaw's daughter, and is the father of Elsie. He had been confined in this chamber by the doctor's contrivance ever since Ormskirk being his jailer, as is foreshadowed in Chapter 40. He has been kept in the belief that he killed Grimshaw in a struggle that took place between them, and that his confinement in the secret chamber is voluntary on his own part, a measure of precaution to prevent arrest and execution for murder. In this miserable delusion he has cowered there for 35 years. This and various other dusky points are partly elucidated in the notes hereafter to be appended to this volume. End footnote. End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 25. Redcliffe apparently had not communicated to his agent in London his change of address when he left the warden's residence to avail himself of the hospitality of Braithwaite Hall, for letters arrived for him from his own country, both private and with the seal of state upon them. One among the rest that bore on the envelope the name of the President of the United States. The good warden was impressed with great respect for so distinguished a signature, and not knowing but that the welfare of the Republic, for which he had an Englishman's contemptuous interest, might be involved in its early delivery at its destination, he determined to ride over to Braithwaite Hall, call on his friend, and deliver it with his own hand. With this purpose he mounted his horse, at the hour of his usual morning ride, and set forth, and before reaching the village saw a figure before him which he recognized as that of the pensioner. "So ho! Whither go you, old friend?" said the warden, drawing his bridle as he came up with the old man. "To Braithwaite Hall, sir," said the pensioner, who continued to walk diligently on, "and I am glad to see your honour, if it be so on the same errand." "Why so?" asked the warden. "You seem much in earnest. Why should my visit to Braithwaite Hall be a special cause of rejoicing?" "Nay," said the pensioner, "your honour is specially interested in this young American who has gone thither to abide, and when one is in a strange country you need some guidance. My mind is not easy about the young man." "Well," said the warden, smiling to himself at the old gentleman's idle and senile fears, "I commend your diligence on behalf of your friend." He rode on as he spoke, and deep in one of the woodland paths he saw the flutter of a woman's garment, and, greatly to his surprise, overtook Elsie, who seemed to be walking along with great rapidity, and, startled by the approach of hoofs behind her, looked up at him with a pale cheek. "Good morning, Miss Elsie," said the warden. "You are taking a long walk this morning. I regret to see that I have frightened you." "Pray, whither are you going?" said she. "To the hall," said the warden, wondering at the abrupt question. "Ah, sir," exclaimed Elsie, "for heaven's sake, pray insist on seeing Mr. Redcliffe. Take no excuse. There are reasons for it." "Certainly, fair lady," responded the warden, wondering more and more at this injuncture from such a source. "And when I see this fascinating gentleman, pray what message am I to give him from Miss Elsie, who moreover seems to be on the eve of visiting him in person?" See him, only see him," said Elsie with passionate earnestness, and in haste. "See him now." She waved him onward as she spoke, and the warden, greatly commoded for the nonce, complied with the maiden's fantasy so far as to ride at a quicker pace, uneasily marveling at what could have aroused this usually shy and reserved girl's nervousness to such a pitch. The incident served at all events to titillate his English sluggishness, so that he approached the avenue of the old hall with a vague expectation of something that had happened there, though he knew not of what nature it could possibly be. However, he rode round to the side entrance, by which horsemen generally entered the house, and, a groom approaching to take his bridle, he alighted and approached the door. I know not whether it were anything more than the glistening moisture common in an English autumnal morning, but so it was that the trace of the bloody footsteps seemed fresh, as if it had been that very night imprinted anew, and the crime made all over again, with fresh guilt upon somebody's soul. When the footman came to the door, responsive to his ring, the warden inquired for Mr. Redcliffe, the American gentleman. "The American gentleman left for London early this morning," replied the footman, in a matter-of-fact way. "Gone!" exclaimed the warden. "This is sudden, and strange that he should go without saying good-bye. Gone!" And then he remembered the old pensioner's eagerness that the warden should come here, and Elsie's strange injunction that he should insist on seeing Redcliffe. "Pray, is Lord Braithwaite at home?" "I think, sir, he is in the library," said the servant, "but we'll see. Pray, sir, walk in." He returned in a moment, and ushered the warden through passages with which he was familiar of old, to the library, where he found Lord Braithwaite sitting with a London newspaper in his hand. He rose and welcomed his guest with great equanimity. To the warden's inquiries after Redcliffe, Lord Braithwaite replied that his guest had that morning left the house, being called to London by letters from America, but of what nature Lord Braithwaite was unable to say, except that they seemed to be of urgency and importance. The warden's further inquiries, which he pushed as far as was decorous, elicited nothing more than this, and he was preparing to take his leave, not seeing any reason for insisting, according to Elsie's desire, on the impossibility of seeing a man who was not there, nor indeed any reason for doing so. And yet it seemed very strange that Redcliffe should have gone so unceremoniously, nor was he half satisfied, though he knew not why he should be otherwise. "Do you happen to know Mr. Redcliffe's address in London?" asked the warden. "Not at all," said Braithwaite, "but I presume there is courtesy enough in the American character to impel him to write to me, or both of us, within a day or two, telling us of his whereabouts and whatabouts. Should you know, I beg you will let me know, for I have already been pleased with this gentleman, and should have been glad could he have favoured me with a somewhat longer visit." There was nothing more to be said, and the warden took his leave, and was about mounting his horse when he beheld the pensioner approaching the house, and he remained standing until he should come up. "You are too late," said he, as the old man drew near. "Our friend has taken French leave." "Mr. Warden," said the old man solemnly, "let me pray you not to give him up so easily. Come with me into the presence of Lord Braithwaite." The warden made some objections, but the pensioner's manner was so earnest that he soon consented, knowing that the strangeness of his sudden return might well enough be put upon the eccentricities of the pensioner, especially as he was so well known to Lord Braithwaite. He accordingly again rang at the door, which being opened by the same stolid footman, the warden desired him to announce to Lord Braithwaite that the warden and a pensioner desired to see him. He soon returned with a request that they should walk in, and ushered them again to the library, where they found the master of the house in conversation with Ormskirk at one end of the apartment, a whispered conversation which detained him a moment after their arrival. The warden fancied that he saw in old Ormskirk's countenance a shade more of that mysterious horror which made him such a bugbear to children, but when Braithwaite turned from him and approached his visitor, there was no trace of any disturbance, beyond a natural surprise to see his good friend the warden so soon after his taking leave. "I see you are surprised," said the latter, "but you must lay the blame, if any, on our good old friend here, who, for some reason, best known to himself, insisted on having my company here." Braithwaite looked to the old pensioner with a questioning look, as if good-humouredly, yet not as if he cared much about it, asking for an explanation. As Ormskirk was about to leave the room, having remained till this time, with that nervous look which distinguished him gazing towards the party, the pensioner made him a sign, which he obeyed as if compelled to do so. "Well, my friend," said the warden, somewhat impatient of the aspect in which he himself appeared, "I beg of you, explain at once to Lord Braithwaite why you have brought me back in this strange way." "It is," said the pensioner quietly, "that in your presence I request him to allow me to see Mr. Redcliffe." "Why, my friend," said Braithwaite, "how can I show you a man who has left my house, and whom in the chances of this life I am not very likely to see again, though hospitality desirous of doing so?" Here ensued a laughing sort of colloquy between the warden and Braithwaite, which the former jocosely excused himself for having yielded to the whim of the pensioner, and returned with him on an errand which he knew well to be futile. "I have long been aware," he said, apart, in a confidential way, "of something a little awry in our old friend's mental system. You will excuse him, and me for humoring him." Of course," said Braithwaite, in the same tone. "I shall not be moved by anything the old fellow can say." The old pensioner, meanwhile, has been, as it were, heating up and gathering himself into a mood of energy which those who saw him had never before witnessed in his usually quiet person. He seemed somehow to grow taller and larger, more impressive. At length, fixing his eye on Lord Braithwaite, he spoke again. "Dark, murderous man!" exclaimed he, "your course has not been unwatched. The secrets of this mansion are not unknown. For 2 centuries back they have been better known to them who dwell afar off than to those resident within the mansion. The foot that made the bloody footstep has returned from its long wanderings, and it passes on, straight as destiny, sure as an avenging providence, to the punishment and destruction of those who incur retribution." "Here is an odd kind of tragedy," said Lord Braithwaite, with a scornful smile. "Come, my friend, lay aside this vein and talk sense." "Not thus do you escape your penalty, hardened and crafty one," exclaimed the pensioner. "I demand of you, before this worthy warden, access to the secret ways of this mansion, of which thou dost unjustly retain possession. I shall disclose for what centuries has remained hidden the ghastly secrets that this house hides." "Humor him," whispered the warden, "and hereafter I will take care that the exuberance of our old friend shall be duly restrained. He shall not trouble you again." Lord Braithwaite, to say the truth, appeared a little flabbergasted and disturbed by these latter expressions of the old gentleman. He hesitated, turned pale, but at last, recovering his momentary confusion and irresolution, he replied with apparent carelessness, "Go wherever you will, old gentleman. The house is open to you for this time. If ever you have another opportunity to disturb it, the fault will be mine." "Follow, sir," said the pensioner, turning to the warden. "Follow, maiden." Footnote: Elsie appears to have joined the party. End of footnote. Now shall a great mystery begin to be revealed. So saying, he led the way before them, passing out of the hall, not by the doorway, but through one of the oaken panels of the wall, which admitted the party into a passage which seemed to pass through the thickness of the wall, and was lighted by interstices through which shone gleams of light. This led them into what looked like a little vestibule or circular room, which the warden, though deeming himself many years familiar with the old house, had never seen before, any more than the passage which led to it. To his surprise, this room was not vacant, for in it sat, in a large old chair, Ormskirk, like a toad in its hole, like some wild, fearful creature in its den, and it was now partly understood how this man had the possibility of suddenly disappearing, so inscrutably, and so in a moment, and when all quest for him was given up, of his suddenly appearing again. "Ha!" said old Ormskirk, slowly rising, as at the approach of some event that he long expected. "Is he coming at last?" "Poor victim of another's iniquity," said the pensioner, "thy release approaches. Rejoice." The old man arose with a sort of trepidation and solemn joy intermixed in his manner, and bowed reverently, as if there were in what he heard more than other ears could understand in it. "Yes, I have waited long," replied he. "Welcome, if my release is come." "Well," said Lord Braithwaite, scornfully, "this secret retreat of my house is known to many. It was the priest's secret chamber when it was dangerous to be of the old and true religion, here in England. There is no longer any use in concealing this place, and the warden or any man might have seen it, or any of the curiosities of the old hereditary house, if desirous so to do." "Aha, son of Belial," quoth the pensioner, "and this too." He took 3 pieces from a certain point of the wall, which he seemed to know, and stooped to press upon the floor. The warden looked at Lord Braithwaite, and saw that he had grown deadly pale. What his change of cheer might bode, he could not guess, but at the pressure of the old pensioner's finger, the floor, or a segment of it, rose like the lid of a box, and discovered a small darksome pair of stairs, within which burned a lamp, lighting it downward, like the steps that descend into a sepulchre. "Follow," said he, to those who looked on wondering. And he began to descend. Lord Braithwaite saw him disappear, then frantically followed, the warden next, and old Ormskirk took his place in the rear, like a man following his inevitable destiny. At the bottom of a winding descent that seemed deep and remote and far within, they came to a door, which the pensioner pressed with a spring, and passing through the space that disclosed itself, the whole party followed, and found themselves in a small gloomy room. On one side of it was a couch, on which sat Redcliffe. Face to face with him was a white-haired figure in a chair. "You are come," said Redcliffe, solemnly, "but too late." "And yonder is the coffer," said the pensioner. "Open but that, and our quest is ended." "That, if I mistake not, I can do," said Redcliffe. He drew forth what he had kept all this time, as something that might yet reveal to him the mystery of his birth, the silver key that had been found by the grave in far New England, and applying it to the lock, he slowly turned it on the hinges that had not been turned for 200 years. All, even Lord Braithwaite, guilty and shame-stricken as he felt, pressed forward to look upon what was about to be disclosed. What were the wondrous contents? The entire mysterious coffer was full of golden ringlets, abundant, clustering through the whole coffer, and living with elasticity, so as immediately, as it were, to flow off the sides of the coffer, and rise in large abundance from the long compression. Into this, by a miracle of natural production, which was known likewise in other cases, into this had been resolved the whole bodily substance of that fair and unfortunate being, known so long in the legends of the family as the beauty of the golden locks. As the pensioner looked at this strange sight, the lustre of the precious and miraculous hair gleaming and glistening, and seeming to add light to the gloomy room, he took from his breast pocket another lock of hair, in a locket, and compared it before their faces with that which brimmed over from the coffer. "It is the same," said he. "And who are you that know it?" asked Redcliffe, surprised. "He whose ancestors taught him the secret, who has had it handed down to him these 2 centuries, and now only with regret yields to the necessity of making it known." "You are the heir," said Redcliffe. In that gloomy room, beside the dead old man, they looked at him, and saw dignity beaming on him, covering his whole figure, that broke out like a lustre at the close of day. End of chapter 25. End of Dr. Grimshaw's Secret by Nathaniel Hawthorne.